The sun blazed high overhead, casting golden warmth across the sprawling park where the air buzzed with the carefree hum of a typical afternoon. Laughter floated like music, mingling with the distant shouts of children darting across the grass, their colorful shirts flickering like wildflowers against the lush green expanse. Near the basketball court, a cluster of teenagers moved with restless energy, their sneakers screeching against the pavement as they dodged and weaved, lost in the rhythm of their game. Families sprawled on blankets, friends traded stories over cold drinks, and the world seemed to pulse with an easy, untroubled joy. But beneath this vibrant surface, a shadow loomed, subtle at first, creeping into the edges of the scene like a storm cloud brushing the horizon. Officer Greg Lawson stood apart from the lively crowd, his broad shoulders cutting a stark silhouette against the casual chaos of the day. His uniform, pristine and starched, gleamed with an almost unnatural sharpness, a jarring contrast to the relaxed sprawl of park-goers around him. He wasn't here to soak in the sunshine or join the Laterno. Lawson carried himself with a purpose that had nothing to do with peace. In this neighborhood, his name was whispered with a mix of dread and resignation. His piercing blue eyes, cold as steel, and his hair-trigger temper had etched his reputation deep into the community's memory. For years, he'd ruled these streets not as a guardian, but as a specter of fear. A man who needed little excuse a sideways glance. A misplaced steptoe unleashes wrath. To the people here, crossing paths with Lawson wasn't just risky. It was a gamble with consequences no one could predict. He'd been stalking the park for over an hour now, his heavy boots thudding against the earth as he prowled its edges. His gaze swept the crowd like a hawk circling prey, restless, hungry for something to seize upon. The teenagers on the court barely registered in his periphery. Their game was too loud, too alive to draw his ire. Instead, his attention snagged on a quieter corner, where a woman sat alone on a weathered bench, her presence unassuming yet somehow magnetic. Her name was Evelyn, though Lawson didn't know that yet. To the untrained eye, she was just another face in the crowd sipping a soda, chatting idly with a friend who'd wandered off moments before, her warm brown eyes crinkling with a smile that softened her features. But Evelyn was no ordinary bystander. Beneath her casual demeanor burned the steady resolve of an FBI agent, undercover and razor-sharp, her instincts honed by years of navigating danger. She didn't seek out trouble, but trouble had a way of finding her, and today, it was striding toward her in polished boots. Evelyn's gaze flickered toward Lawson as he paced, her trained senses picking up the tension radiating from him like heat off asphalt. She'd seen men like him before, power drunk, itching for a fight, their authority a weapon they wielded without care. His eyes darted across the park, predatory, searching for a spark to ignite his simmering rage. She shifted slightly on the bench, her fingers tightening around the cool aluminum of her soda can, a quiet alarm buzzing in the back of her mind. She didn't want a confrontation today, not here, but something told her it was coming anyway. Nearby, a young girl named Mia wove through the crowd, her slight frame trembling faintly as she balanced a tray of snacks in her hands. At barely 17, Mia carried herself with the cautious grace of someone who'd grown up in Lawson's shadow, always glancing over her shoulder, always aware that peace could shatter in an instant. Her dark curls bounced as she stepped carefully, her eyes scanning the sea of faces for her friends lounging near the basketball court. She just wanted to deliver the chips and sodas, to sink into the safety of their chatter and forget the world for a while. But fate, cruel and capricious, had other plans. As she edged past a group of picnickers, her sneaker caught on an uneven patch of ground. She stumbled, and a single soda can slipped from her grasp, tumbling free and rolling with a metallic clatter straight toward Lawson's feet. "Hey, watch it!" His voice boomed like a gunshot, slicing through the park's cheerful din and freezing Mia in her tracks. Her heart lurched into her throat as she locked eyes with him, his glare pinning her like a butterfly to a board. Fear flooded her chest, sharp and cold, stealing the breath from her lungs. "I am so sorry," she stammered, dropping to her knees to snatch the can, her hands shaking so badly she nearly fumbled it again. Her mind spun, blank with panic. She hadn't meant to draw his attention. No one ever wanted that. "Sorry doesn't cut it," Lawson snapped, his tone rising, venom dripping from every syllable. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing the sunlight, his presence suffocating. "You kids think this park's your playground, huh? No respect, no manners." Mia's pulse hammered in her ears as she clutched the can, her knuckles whitening. She hadn't done anything wrong, not really, but Lawson's eyes told her guilt didn't matter. To him, she was a target, a vessel for whatever fury he'd been nursing all day. "Show me some ID." He barked, his hand twitching at his side. Mia's face drained of color, her breath hitching. ID, she didn't have it. She'd left her wallet at home, tucked in a drawer, thinking a trip to the park wouldn't require it. "Don't have it on me," she whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the rustle of leaves overhead. Lawson's lip curled into a sneer, his eyes narrowing to slits. Figures, reckless, irresponsible, typical. She wanted to shrink into the ground, to disappear beneath the grass and escape the weight of his judgment. She was just a kid, barely old enough to drive, and yet here she stood, pinned beneath the wrath of a man who wore his badge like a crown. Her chest tightened, her thoughts racing for an exit that didn't exist. Fairness was a fairy tale in Lawson's world, and she knew it. The crowd around them shifted, murmurs rippling through the air as heads turned, eyes widening at the scene unfolding. A few hands reached for phones, fingers hovering over screens, sensing something was about to break. Before Mia could muster another word, Lawson's hand lashed out, shoving her with a force that sent her reeling. She stumbled backward, her tray crashing to the pavement, cans and chips scattering like shrapnel. Gasps erupted from the onlookers, sharp and jagged, as Mia fought to steady herself, her knees scraping the ground. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst, humiliation and fear tangling in her gut. She hadn't deserved this, no one did, but Lawson didn't care. To him, she was nothing, a speck of dust to be swept away. "Stop!" The command sliced through the chaos, clear and unwavering, halting the crowd's rising panic. Evelyn rose from her bench, her soda abandoned, her posture radiating a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the moment. Every eye swung toward her, drawn by the authority in her voice. Lawson whirled to face her, his features twisting into a scowl. "This doesn't concern you," he spat, his tone laced with disdain. Evelyn stepped forward, unflinching, her dark eyes locking onto his with a steadiness that unnerved him. "Oh, it does," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "It does when you're shoving a kid for no reason." The air thickened, heavy with anticipation, as the crowd held its breath. Evelyn's presence was electric, pulling focus like a beacon in the storm. She wasn't just some passerby stepping into a force, trained to confront men like Lawson, men who saw power as a right rather than a responsibility. He wasn't just a cop doing his job, he was a tyrant in a uniform, drunk on the belief that no one could touch him. The teenagers on the court froze, their game forgotten, their wide eyes darting between the two figures locked in this silent standoff. Even Mia, still crouched amid the wreckage of her snacks, lifted her head, a flicker of hope cutting through her fear. "Let her go," Evelyn said, her words firm, a lifeline thrown into the tension. But Lawson was too far gone, his anger a wildfire blazing out of control. He took a step closer, his chest puffing out, his voice dropping to a growl. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" Evelyn didn't waver, didn't blink. She met his glare head-on, her calm unshaken. "Do you?" she countered, her tone steady, piercing. "I know exactly who you are, officer. You're someone who thinks he can bully whoever he wants. Someone who thinks the law bends to your whims. But it doesn't, not here, not today." The words hung like a gavel strike, reverberating through the park. Lawson's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides, fury boiling beneath his skin. He wasn't used to this defiance, resistance, someone staring him down without a trace of fear. Most shrank from him, scurried away, but Evelyn stood tall, an immovable wall against his tide of rage. The crowd leaned in, their unease morphing into something else, a curiosity, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of courage. Mia's friends edged closer, their faces a mix of worry and awe, whispering among themselves. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. A crack in the armor of a man who'd ruled through terror for too long. Justice, Evelyn knew, wasn't just a word, it was a force. A fire that burned through the lies of men like Lawson. He'd abused his power, believing himself untouchable, but every shove, every sneer, carried a cost. And today, that cost was coming due. The lesson was stark, unyielding. Power without restraint breeds chaos, and those who wield it recklessly will face the consequences, whether from a badge-wearing tyrant's downfall, or the quiet strength of someone brave enough to say enough. As the tension stretched taut, the park held its breath, waiting for the storm to break and for the truth to rise. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as the crowd stood packed together in the park, their breaths shallow and uneven. A restless energy pulsed through them, teetering on the edge of chaos. As they wrestled with their own indecision, some shifted uncomfortably on their feet, their eyes darting between the two figures at the center of the storm, unsure whether to intervene or shrink back into the safety of silence. Others, though, leaned in closer, their hushed voices weaving a thread of quiet rebellion. They were beginning to align themselves with Evelyn, their murmurs carrying a mix of awe and disbelief. It wasn't every day someone dared to rise up against Officer Lawson, a man whose presence loomed over the town like a dark shadow. Now, here they stood, witnessing with their own eyes a defiance that felt both impossible and electric. A woman who refused to bow under his weight. From the edge of the gathering, Mia lingered, her body still trembling from the rough shove Lawson had dealt her moments earlier. Her chest tightened as she watched Evelyn, her heart pounding so fiercely she could hear it thumping in her ears. She'd never seen anyone like Thisamione so unshakably bold, standing tall in the face of a man who thrived on intimidation. To Mia, it was as if Evelyn had stepped out of some legend, a lone warrior squaring off against a tyrant. Fear and admiration churned within her, her wide eyes locked on the scene, unable to look away. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning unfolding in real time. And Evelyn wasn't flinching. Lawson's growl cut through the tension like a jagged blade. "Get out of my way," he snarled, his voice thick with menace, his fists clenched at his sides, knuckles whitening as his temper flared hotter with every passing second. The control he clung to so tightly was slipping through his fingers, and he could feel Ithis' authority unraveling before the watching eyes. He wasn't used to this, wasn't prepared for someone to stand their ground instead of cowering. It gnawed at him, stoking a fury that darkened his scowl. Evelyn, though, remained a pillar of calm amid his storm. "I'm not going anywhere," she replied, her voice steady and smooth, carrying a quiet strength that seemed to pierce the air. With a deliberate motion, she reached into her jacket, her fingers brushing the fabric before emerging with a badge. The sunlight glinted off the metallic FBI emblem, a sudden flash that sliced through the moment. For an instant, Lawson Faltretta's eyes widened, his breath caught, and he stumbled back a step. The crowd felt it too, a ripple of shock spreading outward like a stone dropped into still water. Time seemed to freeze, the world holding its breath as the weight of that badge sank in. Whispers erupted into a low roar of murmurs, threading through the onlookers like wildfire catching dry grass. Some grasped the gravity of what they were seeing, a federal agent standing toe-to-toe with their local bully in uniform, while others simply gaped, stunned by the revelation. This wasn't just some random woman, this was someone with power, someone who carried the law in her hands. But Lawson wasn't about to let his pride crumble so easily. He shook off the initial jolt, his face hardening into a mask of defiance. "So what?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You gonna lecture me now? You think you've got any say here?" His bravado was a desperate grasp at the dominance he'd always wielded like a club. Evelyn's gaze didn't flicker, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that could have burned through steel. "I've got jurisdiction over right and wrong, officer," she said, her words sharp and deliberate, slicing through his bluster like a whip cracking in the silence. "And you just crossed that line." The statement landed hard, reverberating through the crowd, who collectively held their breath, waiting for the next move. This wasn't a petty squabble anymore, it was something monumental, a clash that promised to erupt into chaos. Lawson's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward, closing the gap between them. His voice dropped to a low, guttural hiss, each word laced with threat. "You don't know who you're talking to, do you?" His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to reclaim the power he felt slipping away. He'd spent years building a reputation as untouchable, A man who bent others to his will with a glare or a shove. To be challenged like this openly, fearless didn't just anger him, it unmoored him, pushing him into a corner where desperation clawed at his chest. Evelyn didn't blink. Her face remained a mask of composure, but beneath it burned a resolve forged in iron. "I know exactly who I'm talking to," she said, her tone even but unyielding. "I'm talking to a man who thinks he's above the law, but you're not, and I'm going to make sure everyone sees that." Her words were a promise, not a threat, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd already won the moral battle. The crowd was alive now, buzzing with energy as hands fumbled for phones, pulling them from pockets and bags. Cameras pointed toward the standoff, capturing every second of the drama. The park, once a place of lazy afternoons and idle chatter, had transformed into a stage for something raw and unscripted. People stopped in their tracks, joggers paused mid-stride. Parents forgot their kids tugging at their sleeves, all eyes riveted on the confrontation. Some recorded in silence, their breaths held, while others whispered to each other, their voices a mix of excitement and unease. They were waiting, watching, anticipating the spark that would ignite the powder keg. And then it came. In a blur of motion, Lawson's temper snapped. His fist shot out, a lightning-fast strike aimed straight for Evelyn's face. But she was ready, her instincts honed, her body moving with the grace of someone who'd faced danger before. She sidestepped the blow effortlessly, her feet sliding across the grass as if she'd choreographed the moment. In one fluid motion, she caught his wrist, twisting it with a practiced flick that sent him sprawling. Lawson hit the pavement with a heavy thud, the impact jarring the air from his lungs. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, a sound that seemed to echo off the trees. As the once mighty officer lay dazed, his pride scattered across the ground like broken glass. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, pure, stunned silence. No one could believe it. The man who'd strode through their lives like a king, untouchable and feared, was now sprawled out, struggling to push himself up. Evelyn stood over him, her stance tall and unshaken. She didn't revel in the victory, didn't let a smirk cross her lips. Instead, she stepped back, her eyes sweeping the crowd with quiet authority. "Keep recording," she said, her voice ringing clear and firm. "Let everyone see the truth." Mia, still quaking at the edges of the scene, fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she pressed record. She couldn't tear her eyes away, her breath hitching as she watched Evelyn command the moment. Shock still gripped her, her mind racing to catch up with what she'd just witnessed. But beneath it surged a flicker of something new, hope. For so long, Lawson had been a force no one dared challenge, a storm that swept through their lives leaving fear in its wake. Now, someone had faced him down, and that someone was Evelyn. Lawson groaned from the ground, his pride in tatters, his chest heaving with a mix of fury and humiliation. His hand shook as he reached for his radio, clutching it like a lifeline. "Back up," he rasped into it, his voice low and seething. "I need backup. Violent suspect assaulting an officer." The lie dripped from his lips, a desperate bid to reclaim the narrative. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. She stood her ground, her eyes steady as she met his glare. "You brought this on yourself," she said, her tone calm but cutting. "The truth's right there." She gestured toward the sea of phones, their lenses trained on the scene, capturing every damning second. The wail of sirens sliced through the air, growing louder as police cars screeched to a halt near the park's edge. Officers poured out, their hands hovering near holsters, their faces tight with uncertainty. The crowd parted nervously, stepping back as the newcomers surrounded Evelyn, Lawson, and Mia. The tension thickened, pressing down like a storm about to break. Whispers mingled with murmurs, a tangle of confusion and fear threading through the onlookers. Some still didn't know who to trust, their eyes flicking between the fallen officer and the woman who'd brought him down. Lawson, still sprawled on the pavement, tried to claw back some semblance of control. "She assaulted me," he bellowed, jabbing a finger toward Evelyn. "Arrest her," his voice cracked with desperation. But Evelyn raised a hand, slow and deliberate, her badge gleaming in the sunlight. She wasn't resisting, did need to. "You've all seen the footage," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's clear who the real aggressor is." The arriving officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. Some peered at the crowd, where phones remained raised, the footage already leaking across the internet like ink spilling over a page. A young officer, his face etched with discomfort, stepped back, his brow furrowing. "Wait," he muttered, almost to himself. "Is she FBI?" The question hung there, fragile but piercing, and for a moment, Lawson's bravado cracked. His grip on power, the armor he'd worn for years, was fracturing before their eyes. The air remained thick, heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. The crowd, once carefree, now stood gripped by an uneasy quiet, their gazes locked on the scene. Police cars formed a loose ring around them, their sirens fading into a haunting echo. The officers stood rigid, some shifting uncomfortably, others staring as if trying to piece together a puzzle with missing edges. No one moved. No one spoke. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. Lawson sat there, fists clenched, his mind a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. His reputation had been everything: control, power, fear, and now it lay shattered at his feet. He couldn't recall the last time anyone had dared defy him, let alone dismantle him so effortlessly. But the crowd's judgment was unyielding. The videos were spreading, the truth escaping his grasp, and even his fellow officers couldn't mask their unease. He wasn't the invincible figure he'd once been, just a man, flawed and fallen, facing the consequences of his own hubris. Evelyn, though, stood resolute, her eyes never leaving the encircling officers. She knew the next moments would shape everything. She had to stay steady, had to see this through. This wasn't just about Lawson or me, it was about justice, about exposing the rot of unchecked power. She glanced toward the park's edge, where more officers arrived, their steps hesitant, their confidence shaken. They weren't charging in like they owned the place. They were faltering, unsure of the ground they stood on. Evelyn wasn't here to retreat. This was her stand, a fight for accountability that rippled far beyond this park. A lesson carved in the dust at Lawson's feet. No one was above the law, and the cost of believing otherwise was steep. In the sprawling expanse of the park, where the late afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows over the grass, the air crackled with an electric tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface of every breath. For Mia, this wasn't just a fleeting moment of chaos, it was a crucible, one that would either forge her resolve or leave her broken. She stood off to the side, her small frame dwarfed by the swelling crowd, her phone gripped tightly in her trembling hands as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Her wide eyes flickered with a storm of emotions. Fear gnawed at her gut, twisting it into knots. Yet there was a fragile glimmer of hope flickering in her chest, a desperate wish that the courage she'd just witnessed might shield her from the storm she felt brewing. She wasn't sure if it was enough. Her heart thudded against her ribcage, each beat a question. Would this bravery save her? Would it save any of them? Evelyn, standing at the center of it all, felt the weight of countless eyes boring into her. The world seemed to slow as she turned her head, her sharp gaze slicing through the chaos to lock onto Mia's. For a fleeting second, time stretched thin, the clamor of the crowd fading into a dull roar. The space between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words and shared stakes. Evelyn saw more than just a frightened girl clutching a finesse, saw a mirror of her younger self, a soul teetering on the edge of understanding what it meant to defy the darkness. There was something tender in that gaze, a quiet humanity that softened the steel in Evelyn's spine. She knew this wasn't just about her own stand against injustice anymore. Mia was no longer a bystander. She was woven into the fabric of this fight, her trembling hands holding proof of a truth that could not be undone. The lesson Evelyn carried burned brightly within her. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire you stoked with your own hands. No matter how they shook, she had to show Mia that fear didn't erase the worth of standing tall, that the sting of terror was nothing compared to the rot of silence. "She's going to be just fine," Evelyn declared, her voice cutting through the din with a calm certainty that anchored the moment. She shifted her attention back to the officers encircling her, their boots scuffing the dirt as they closed in. Her chin tilted upward, a subtle but unmistakable challenge, daring them to test her resolve. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. Her stillness was a weapon all its own. The officers were mere steps away now, their presence looming like storm clouds over the sunlit park. Their hands hovered near their holsters, fingers twitching with indecision. Among them was a young officer, barely past his mid-20s, his boyish face taut with nerves. His eyes darted frantic calibers to Officer Lawson, sprawled on the ground in a heap of bruised pride, then to Evelyn, unyielding as stone, and finally to the restless crowd pressing in around them. He was a rookie, caught in a moment far bigger than his training had prepared him for. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he took a hesitant step forward, his voice cracking as he spoke. "You're under arrest," he stammered, the words tumbling out like a shaky accusation, "for assaulting a police officer." The charge lingered in the air, fragile and unconvincing. Evelyn didn't even blink. Her composure was a fortress, unshaken by the young officer's faltering authority. "Is that so?" she replied, her tone smooth and unruffled, carrying the weight of someone who knew the scales of truth tipped in her favor. "You might want to check the footage before you commit to that." Her words landed like a quiet thunderclap, rippling through the officer's ranks. The young man froze, his resolve crumbling as he glanced at his colleagues, their faces etched with the same uncertainty. The cameras were still rolling me as among the manned, the crowd's murmurs swelled into a restless hum. They had all seen it, Evelyn's measured response, born of self-defense. Against Lawson's reckless aggression, the truth was a spotlight, and it burned too brightly for anyone to look away. Taking a deep breath, Evelyn steadied herself, her eyes flicking downward to where Lawson struggled to rise. The once commanding officer was a meshy's face flushed a deep crimson, a cocktail of rage and shame twisting his features into something feral. His wild gaze swept the crowd, searching for an ally, a scapegoat, anything to claw back his slipping control. But the park offered him no refuge. His uniform, once a symbol of power, now clung to him like a tattered flag of defeat. "Don't make this worse for yourself," Evelyn said, her voice low but piercing, each syllable deliberate. "You've already misstepped, and everyone here saw it. Soon, the whole world will." The warning hung between them, a lifeline he refused to grasp. The young officer's shoulders slumped, the gravity of the scene crashing down on him. He wasn't just witnessing a routine arrest gone earth. This was a reckoning, a fracture in the facade of authority he'd been taught to uphold. Lawson's glare bore into him, a scalding mix of fury and betrayal. But before the older man could spit out a defense, Evelyn silenced him. "Save your breath," she said, her voice a blade of finality. "You've got nothing left to say." The words shifted the air itself, a tide turning against Lawson as the other officers stepped back, their confidence unraveling. The rookie averted his eyes, unable to meet Evelyn's steady gaze, his hands falling limp at his sides. But the crowd wasn't content to wait for the officers to untangle their hesitation. The murmur grew into a roar, a living force that pulsed through the park. Phones were raised high, their lenses glinting in the fading light, capturing every angle of the unfolding drama. Then, piercing through the din, came Mia's voice, small but resolute, trembling yet fierce. She thrust her phone skyward, her arm shaking with the weight of her conviction. "Everyone needs to see this," she shouted, her words slicing through the chaos. "Look at what he did." The declaration was a spark, igniting the tension into something unbearable, something transformative. The park erupted. Dozens of onlookers, once passive spectators, now leaned forward, their devices trained on the scene like a chorus of unblinking eyes. The air thrummed with their collective outrage, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Lawson, still scrambling for footing, felt the ground shift beneath him. His hands balled into fists, knuckles whitening as he gripped at the last threads of his authority. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, his body coiled with a fury he could barely contain. This wasn't how it was supposed to be, was the law, the enforcer, the one who bent the world to his will. Yet here he was, challenged by a woman, a federal agent. No Leswo had flipped his dominion upside down, with nothing but her steady hands and sharper mind. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Lawson snarled, his voice a guttural rasp dripping with venom. "This is my territory. You don't get to waltz in and turn it against me." His words were a desperate clawing at power, but Evelyn met them with an unshakable calm. "I'm not walking away," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet ferocity. "You chose to escalate this. I'm just ensuring you face what comes next." Her resolve was a wall, built brick by brick from a lifetime of fighting for what was right, and Lawson's pride couldn't breach it. In a flash of reckless fury, He lunged at her, his arms swinging wide in a clumsy arc. It was a move born of desperation, not skill, fueled by the bitter sting of his unraveling control. The crowd gasped, a sharp intake of breath that rippled through the air. But Evelyn was a step ahead, her instincts honed by years of facing down men like him. She sidestepped with fluid grace, the air parting around her like water, and in one seamless motion, she seized his arm mid-swing. A twist, a pivot, and Lawson was down, crashing to the pavement with a bone-jarring thud that echoed through the park. The sound was a brutal punctuation mark, a testament to the consequences of his arrogance. He lay there, stunned, his breath stolen, his pride scattered like shards of glass around him. The crowd stood frozen, their gasps louder than the park's earlier hum of life. Evelyn didn't move at first, her shadow falling over Lawson as he struggled to push himself up, his face a mask of red-hot humiliation. She looked down at him, then turned her gaze to Mia. "You okay?" she asked, her voice softening but retaining its strength. Mia, still recording, her hands quaking, nodded faintly. "Yeah," she whispered, the word barely audible but brimming with a dawning realization. This wasn't just a scuffle, it was a lesson in power, in justice, in the cost of abuse, and the strength to confront it. Evelyn's eyes swept back to the officers, their expressions a kaleidoscope of shock and uncertainty. The young rookie stared at the ground, his earlier bravado extinguished. Another officer, older and grizzled, shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing his radio as if debating a call he wasn't sure he could make. The balance had tipped, and Lawson's fall was a warning, a stark reminder that power, when wielded without restraint, could crumble under its own weight. The crowd's roar grew louder, a tide of voices demanding accountability, and in that moment, Evelyn and Mia stood as twin pillars of a truth too loud to silence. The air in the park was thick with tension, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone present. The balance of power, once so firmly in Officer Lawson's grip, had slipped away like sand through his trembling fingers. He wasn't the commanding figure he'd been moments ago no longer, the untouchable authority barking orders with unshakable confidence. Now, he was just a man, scrambling, desperate to claw back control as the world shifted beneath him. His hand darted toward his radio, fumbling awkwardly as his sweaty fingers struggled to find purchase. His voice, usually so steady and authoritative, cracked like brittle glass, revealing the raw panic bubbling beneath the surface. "Back up," he shouted into the static-filled device, his words a chaotic blend of fury and fear. "I need backup now." Violent suspect, assaulting an officer. His chest heaved as he spoke, his breath shallow and uneven, as though each syllable cost him more than he could afford to give. The radio crackled faintly in response, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the noise like a distant lifeline. "Backup's on the way," she said, her tone clipped and professional, but to Lawson, it might as well have been silence. He didn't hear her really. His wide, frantic eyes darted toward the growing crowd, their murmurs swelling into a restless hum that grated against his nerves. His face twisted into a mask of rage, cheeks flushed red, jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might shatter. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. The people gathered around him weren't just onlookers anymore. They were witnesses, their phones held high like torches, capturing every faltering move he made. They hungered for justice, their collective gaze burning with a quiet, unrelenting demand for the truth to be laid bare. Evelyn Carter stood a few paces away, her movements deliberate and measured, a stark contrast to Lawson's frantic flailing. She took a slow step back, her sharp eyes never leaving the officers closing in around her. Her heart thudded steadily in her chest, but her face betrayed none of the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't ready to lower her guard, not yet, not when the stakes were this high. Her dark hair fluttered slightly in the breeze, framing a face etched with determination and calm resolve. She'd seen men like Lawson before, men who wielded power like a blunt weapon, swinging it recklessly until it turned on them. Inside, she felt a flicker of satisfaction, not joy, but a grim acknowledgement that the tide was turning. The crowd's energy bolstered her, their voices rising like a chorus, amplifying the weight of the moment. In the distance, the piercing wail of sirens sliced through the air, growing louder with every passing second. Tires screeched against the pavement as police cars roared into the park, their flashing lights painting the scene in erratic bursts of red and blue. The crowd parted nervously, some stepping back with wide eyes, others craning their necks to get a better view. Officers spilled out of the vehicles, their boots thudding against the ground, hands hovering near holsters as they scanned the chaotic scene. Their faces were a mix of confusion and readiness, unsure of what they'd walked into but prepared for trouble all the same. Evelyn didn't flinch. She stood her ground, arms hanging loosely at her sides, her posture relaxed yet unyielding. She wasn't about to back down now, not after everything she'd witnessed. The memory of Lawson's fist crashing into that teenage boy's face flashed through her mind, igniting a quiet fury deep within her. She'd stepped in because it was right, because someone had to, and now she'd see it through. The newly arrived officers formed a loose circle around Evelyn, Lawson, and Mia, a teenage girl who stood off to the side, her thin frame trembling slightly as she clutched her phone. Mia's wide, tear-streaked eyes darted between the adults, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She'd been the spark that lit this fire, the one Lawson had targeted in a moment of unchecked rage. Now, she was a silent witness, her presence a haunting reminder of why this mattered. The officers hesitated, their movements uncertain, as if they could sense the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They exchanged quick, uneasy glances, their hands twitching near their belts. The crowd's phones stayed trained on the scene, recording every breath, every faltering step. The officers knew they were being watched not just by the people in the park, but by the world beyond, a thought that made their stomachs twist with unease. Evelyn raised a hand slowly, her voice cutting through the chaos with a steady clarity that silenced the murmurs around her. "I'm not resisting," she said, her tone calm but laced with an unshakable firmness. "You all have the footage. You can see for yourselves who started this." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication, daring anyone to challenge the truth she'd laid bare. A young officer, barely out of his 20s, stepped forward hesitantly. His pale face glistened with a thin sheen of sweat, and his eyes flickered nervously toward the badge pinned to Evelyn's jacket. He couldn't have been more than a rookie, his uniform still crisp and new, his posture stiff with inexperience. "Ma'am," he said, his voice small and almost apologetic, "we're just trying to figure out what happened here." His gaze darted toward Lawson, then back to Evelyn, as if searching for a script he hadn't been given. Evelyn drew a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with deliberate calm. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, their anticipation pressing against her like a physical force. "What happened is clear," she replied, her voice unwavering, resonant with the weight of conviction. "Your colleague assaulted a teenage-era kid who didn't deserve it, and now he's trying to bury his mistake by pointing the finger at me. But the truth doesn't bend, officer. It's on tape. Watch it." Her words were a challenge, a quiet command that rippled through the group. The young officer's face shifted, his brows knitting together as realization dawned. He glanced back at Lawson, who was still sprawled on the ground, his uniform smeared with dirt, his pride in tatters. The older officer's hands gripped the earth as he tried to push himself up, his movements sluggish, weighed down by the humiliation seeping into his bones. Lawson's colleagues, once so quick to rally behind him, now stood frozen, their loyalty wavering. They'd seen the footage here, at least heard the crowd's whispers about it, and doubt crept into their eyes like shadows. They weren't sure who to stand with anymore, and that uncertainty was everything. The air seemed to thicken, the distant sirens blending into a mournful drone as time stretched thin. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension coiling tighter around them all. Lawson, still on his knees, glared up at Evelyn with a mix of fury and desperation. His face was a battlefield of emotions warring with shame, his flushed cheeks stark against the pallor of his skin. He'd always been the one in control, the one who called the shots, but now he was exposed, his authority stripped away by the very people he'd sworn to command. "Get up," one of the newer officers muttered, his voice barely audible. Lacking the force of a command, it was more a plea, a quiet hope that Lawson could salvage some shred of dignity. But Lawson ignored him. Instead, he snatched his radio again, his shaking hands betraying the panic clawing at his chest. "I need backup," he barked, his voice splintering with fear. "I'm being assaulted, this woman, this agent. She's resisting arrest." The words tumbled out in a frantic rush, but they rang hollow, a desperate bid to rewrite the narrative crumbling around him. Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step forward. Her gaze locked on Lawson's. The park seemed to lean in, the crowd holding its breath as the atmosphere shifted. She could feel their anticipation, their need for resolution, vibrating through the air. Then, with a fluid motion, she reached into her jacket. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Officers tensed, hands inching toward weapons, the crowd gasping as one. But what she pulled out wasn't a threat. It was her FBI badge. Gleaming faintly in the afternoon light, she held it up, her fingers steady, her posture unyielding. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the crowd, sharp and electric. Some officers stepped back, their faces flickering with shock. Lawson's hand froze midair, the radio dangling uselessly from his grip as the color drained from his face. "FBI," the young officer murmured, his voice barely a whisper, his wide eyes darting between Evelyn and Lawson. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, his mind racing to catch up with the revelation. Evelyn didn't give him time to flounder. "Yes, FBI," she said, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade, firm and unapologetic. "My name is Evelyn Carter, and you, Officer Lawson, have crossed a line." The words landed like a gavel, final and resounding. A stillness settled over the park, an almost tangible pause as the weight of her authority sank in. Lawson seemed to shrink, his broad shoulders hunching inward, the fire in his eyes dimming to a flicker of dread. "I don't care who you are," he stammered, scrambling to find his footing, both literally and figuratively. "You've got no jurisdiction here. You're just a civilian playing hero." His voice trembled, the bravado he clung to fraying at the edges. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing through his defiance like a spotlight through fog. "This isn't about jurisdiction," she said, stepping closer, her voice low but heavy with intent. "This is about what's right. You assaulted a minor, Lawson, a kid, and that's a crime. No badge, no rank, no amount of shouting into that radio can change that." Lawson's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes darted around the park, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The humiliation was palpable now, a bitter taste he couldn't swallow. He wasn't used to this, to being questioned, to being held accountable. For years, he'd wielded his power like a shield, untouchable and unquestioned. Now, that shield was shattered, and the crowd wasn't about to let him forget it. Their voices rose, a chaotic blend of cheers and whispers, phones still raised high as they documented his fall. The other officers shifted uneasily, their once solid allegiance to Lawson crumbling. One of them, a grizzled veteran with graying hair, spoke up from the back, his voice quiet but firm. "We've seen the footage," he said, his eyes meeting Lawson's for a fleeting moment. "It's all there. You're on tape." The words hit Lawson like a punch, draining the last of the color from his face. He looked small now, smaller than Evelyn had ever imagined he could be. The towering arrogance, the unshakable confidence that had defined him was gone, replaced by a man laid bare in the harsh light of truth. He sat there, stunned, his hands limp at his sides, grasping for a way to claw back his dignity. But it was too late. The truth had taken root, spreading through the crowd, the officers, the very air around them. There was no undoing it. Evelyn exhaled, her gaze sweeping over the Senate officers grappling with their uncertainty. The crowd buzzing with righteous fervor. Mia standing silently with her phone still clutched in her hands. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry over the noise. "This is about justice. It's about what happens when power is abused, when those who are supposed to protect us turn into the ones we need protection from. You've seen it, you've recorded it. Now, it's up to all of you to decide what comes next." The park fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over them like a storm cloud. Lawson's defeat was a lesson, a stark reminder that no one was above the consequences of their actions, not even those who hid behind a badge. And as the sirens wailed on in the distance, Evelyn stood tall, her presence a beacon of resolve, knowing that this wasn't just a victory for her or Mia. but a crack in the foundation of unchecked power, a step toward something better. The air in the park was heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of the truth that refused to be buried. It pressed down on everyone present, a suffocating blanket of realization that justiciarial, unyielding justice was finally clawing its way to the surface. Officer Lawson, once a towering figure of authority, now sat crumpled on the patchy grass, his uniform wrinkled and stained with the dirt of his own downfall. His chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths, and his hands trembled as they gripped the earth beneath him. The arrogance that had once defined him swagger, the sneering confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of a man who could feel the world slipping out from under him. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly, searching the growing crowd for a lifeline, for even a flicker of sympathy or support, but there was none to be found. The faces staring back at him were a mix of disgust, anger, and quiet triumph. Phones remained raised, their tiny lenses capturing every twitch of his expression, every muttered word that spilled from his lips. This wasn't just his undoing, it was a public reckoning. Evelyn stood a few feet away, her posture unyielding, her FBI badge catching the late afternoon sunlight in a glint of cold, resolute steel. She didn't flinch, didn't waver, even as the tension around her thickened like storm clouds rolling in. Her dark hair fluttered slightly in the breeze, but her eye sharp, steady, and piercing remained locked on Lawson. Inside, her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the fierce clarity of purpose. She had seen men like him before, men who wore their badges like crowns, who wielded their power like a blunt weapon to crush anyone who dared to question them. She knew the damage they could do, the lives they could shatter, and she'd made a promise to herself long ago that she wouldn't let it stand not on her watch. Today, that promise felt more alive than ever, coursing through her veins like fire. This wasn't just about Lawson, or even the teenager he'd shoved to the ground in a fit of unprovoked rage. No, this was about something far greater, a system that had let men like him thrive for too long, a structure rotten with the corrosion of unchecked power. And Evelyn was determined to see it crack. "You're making a mistake, you know," Lawson growled, his voice low and gravelly, laced with a bitterness that couldn't mask the desperation underneath. He shifted his weight, trying to push himself up, but his movements were clumsy, almost pitiful. His fists clenched tighter, knuckles whitening as he glared up at her. "You really think people are gonna buy this? You think they'll stand with you?" His words dripped with venom, but they fell flat, swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. He wanted to believe he still had control, that he could twist this narrative back into his favor. But the truth was a beast he couldn't torment it anymore. The people watching weren't just spectators, they were witnesses, their phones turning this moment into something permanent, something that would echo far beyond the edges of this park. Lawson's bravado was unraveling, thread by thread, and he could feel it. His wild gaze flickered to the faces around him, searching for an ally, a nod. Anything but all he found was judgment. Evelyn didn't blink. "I'm not the one making a mistake," she said, her voice calm but cutting, slicing through the haze of his defiance. "You are. You're the one who crossed the line. You're the one who put your hands on a kid who didn't deserve it, all because you thought you could. And now you're scrambling to justify it, but it's too late. The truth's out, Lawson, and it's not going anywhere." Her words were deliberate, each one landing like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the air. She could see the fury twisting his features, the way his jaw tightened and his fist shook. For a moment, she thought he might lunge at her again, a final, desperate act to reclaim the dominance he'd lost. But something held him back. Maybe it was the cameras, maybe it was the crowd, or maybe it was the unshakable certainty in her eyes. Whatever it was, it kept him pinned to the ground, a broken king on a crumbling throne. Around them, the park buzzed with restless energy. The grass was worn thin from countless footsteps, the trees casting long, jagged shadows across the scene. A faint breeze carried the scent of damp earth and distant traffic, but it did little to ease the suffocating tension. The crowd had swelled now, a sea of faces stretching back toward the park's edge, parents clutching their kids' hands, teenagers whispering to each other, an old man leaning on a cane with a look of weary recognition in his eyes. They weren't just watching anymore. They were part of this, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Some had been hesitant at first, unsure whether to trust Evelyn's stand against a uniformed officer. But as the seconds ticked by, as Lawson's mask slipped further, their uncertainty gave way to something stranger, something like hope. They saw a woman who wouldn't back down, who wouldn't let power silence the powerless, and it stirred something deep within them. Among the officers who'd arrived with Lawson, a shift was brewing. They'd started out standing in a loose semicircle around Evelyn, their hands resting near their belts, their faces hard with loyalty to their own. But now, that loyalty was fraying. Some shuffled their feet, their boots scuffing against the dirt as they exchanged uneasy glances. Their eyes weren't on Lawson anymore, they were on Evelyn, on the crowd, on the truth that was unfolding in front of them. One of them, a younger officer with dark hair and a nervous twitch in his hands, seemed particularly rattled. He couldn't have been more than 25, his face still soft with youth, his uniform crisp but slightly too big, like he hadn't quite grown into it yet. His name was stitched onto his chest. Officer Daniel hastened. His hazel eyes flickered with a storm of conflicting emotions, doubt, fear, maybe even shame. He'd joined the force wanting to help people, to be a shield for the weak. But days like this made him wonder if he'd wandered into something darker instead. Evelyn turned to him, her gaze softening just enough to reach past his uncertainty. "You don't have to follow him," she said, her voice quieter now, almost gentle, but still firm with conviction. "You can do better. You can be better." She held his stare, willing him to see the choice in front of him, not just a split-second decision, but a fork in the road that could define who he'd become. Daniel's breath hitched, his hands dropping slowly to his sides. He could feel the weight of her words settling into his chest, heavy and inescapable. He'd seen what Lawson did, watched him shove that teenage boy to the ground, heard the kid's startled cry, felt the sick twist in his gut when he realized there'd been no reason for it. But he'd stayed silent, stayed loyal, because that's what you did, right? You backed your own. Except now, standing here with the crowd's eyes on him and Evelyn's voice cutting through the noise, he wasn't so sure. For a fleeting moment, Daniel's mind raced. He thought of his father, a retired cop who had always told him the badge was a responsibility, not a free pass. He thought of the late nights at the academy, the promises he'd made to himself about doing the right thing. And he thought of Lawson Ungry. Reckless Lawson would laughed off complaints and bragged about keeping people in line. Daniel had never liked him, not really, but he'd followed orders because that's how it worked, until now. Now, with the truth laid bare and the world watching, he felt a spark of something new, something like courage. His lips parted, and he took a shaky step back, his hands trembling as they hung uselessly at his sides. I think we need to talk," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried in the stillness. He glanced at his fellow officers, searching their faces for a sign they felt it tooth unraveling. The shift. Lawson's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a flicker of panic. "Don't you dare," he snarled, his voice rising, cracking with desperation. "You don't know what you're doing, Hayes. You don't know what this'll cost you." But Daniel didn't look at him. He couldn't. Instead, he turned to the other officers, whispering something low and urgent. One of them, a stocky man with graying hair and a perpetually furrowed brow, nodded slowly, his jaw tight. Another, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense air, shifted her weight, her hand drifting away from her holster. They were waking up, one by one, to the reality of what they'd been part of. Lawson's reign was over, not because of Evelyn alone, but because the truth had a momentum of its own now, and it was pulling them all along with it. Evelyn exhaled, a slow, steady breath that grounded her amid the chaos. She could feel the tide turning, the crowd's murmurs growing louder, more insistent. People were shouting now, words of support, of outrage, of demand. "Lock him up," someone yelled, and the cry was echoed by others, a chorus of voices rising like a wave. But Evelyn didn't let it distract her. Her focus stayed on Lawson, who was still sprawled on the ground, his face a twisted mask of rage and fear. He knew what was coming, the consequences of his actions, sires of bullying, of intimidation, of hiding behind his badgewear crashing down around him, and there was no escape. Justice wasn't just a word anymore. It was a force alive and breathing, and it had found him at last. The park seemed to hold its breath, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might shatter. Evelyn stood tall, her shadow stretching long across the grass, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. She thought of the teenager Lawson had Tacady's wide, frightened eyes, the way he'd scrambled to his feet and run, the bruise already blooming on his arm. She thought of all the others like him, the ones who'd suffered in silence because men like Lawson thought they were untouchable. And she thought of the lesson etched into this moment. Power without accountability was a poison, and justice, though slow, was a cure that couldn't be stopped once it started to spread. This wasn't the end, not for her, not for the fight. It was a beginning, a spark that would burn brighter and farther than anyone could imagine, lighting up every dark corner where the powerful preyed on the weak. And as the crowd's voices swelled, as Daniel and the others stepped away from Lawson's shadow, Evelyn knew one thing for certain: the truth had weight, and it would not be ignored. His chest heaved violently, each breath shallow and ragged, as if the air itself fought to escape his tightening lungs. Sweat glistened on his brow, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles whitened, trembling with the effort to hold onto something anything might pull him back. From the abyss of his crumbling pride, Lawson's eyes darted wildly, searching for an anchor in the chaos, a lifeline to drag him out of the wreckage he'd made of his reputation. But the truth had already unfurled its wings, soaring beyond his reach, carried by the murmurs of the crowd, the unblinking lenses of cameras, and the stunned gazes of the officers who had once stood firmly at his side. There was no hiding it now. No amount of bluster could erase what they'd all seen. His shame was a public spectacle, laid bare under the harsh light of scrutiny, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a physical force. "I don't have to take this," Lawson rasped, his voice rough and jagged, scraping against the air like sandpaper. He was still grasping for defiance, a flicker of the authority he'd once wielded so carelessly. But it was a hollow sound, brittle and unconvincing even to his own ears. His options had evaporated, leaving him stranded in the open, defenseless. No allies rushed to his aid. No one stepped forward to shield him from the consequences closing in. Even the officers who had once mirrored his every move now exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty fraying at the edges as they shifted on their feet, caught between duty and doubt. The park around them buzzed with restless energophones held aloft like torches, capturing every faltering step he took, every crack in his fouade. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were bearing witness, and Lawson felt the sting of their judgment like 1,000 tiny cuts. Evelyn stood a few paces away, her presence steady as a rock in a storm. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. Her eyes locked on him with a quiet intensity that unnerved him more than any shout could have. Her face was calm, almost serene, but beneath that stillness burned a resolve as unyielding as steel. This wasn't about her pride or his downfall, not anymore. For Evelyn, it had grown beyond the personal, beyond the clash of wills playing out in this sunlit park. It was about peeling back the layers of deception, about dragging the truth into the open where it couldn't be buried or ignored. She'd stepped into this fray not for herself, but because she couldn't stomach the sight of power twisting into something cruel, something unjust. And now, with every breath she took, she was determined to see it through, to ensure that the lesson stuck. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Lawson's twisted with a volatile mix of fury and desperation. Evelyn's unwavering and clear. The tension between them crackled like a live wire. Then, in a sudden, reckless burst, Lawson lurched forward, his hands thrusting out as if he could shove her aside, plow through the wall of reality she represented, and reclaim the control slipping through his fingers. It was a frantic, almost animalistic move, born of a man who believed he could still bend the world to his will. But Evelyn was ready. Her body moved with a grace that belied the speed of her reaction. She sidestepped his charge effortlessly, her motions fluid and precise, like a dancer turning away from a clumsy partner. His outstretched hands grasped only air, and she seized the moment, her fingers closing around his arm with a grip honed by years of discipline. With a swift twist, she bent his wrist backward, the sharp jolt of pain ripping a gasp from Lawson's throat. His momentum betrayed him, sending him stumbling forward, off balance and flailing. The crowd sucked in a collective breath, a wave of gasps rippling through the onlookers as their phones tracked his fall. Evelyn didn't hesitate, spun with him, using his own force against him. And in one seamless motion, she sent him crashing to the ground. The impact reverberated through the park, a dull, heavy thud against the pavement that seemed to hang in the air. Lawson sprawled there, dazed, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the shock and the blooming ache in his bones. His face contorted, a mask of disbelief and agony, while the world around him tilted on its axis. For a heartbeat, silence gripped the park. A stunned pause as everyone absorbed what had just happened. Then the dam broke, shouts erupted, a chaotic symphony of cheers and murmurs swelling into a roar. Some clapped, their applause sharp and defiant. Others whispered in awe, their voices threading through the thick, charged atmosphere. Victory hung in the air, tangible and electric, a current that pulsed through the gathered throng. The officers who had lingered on the sidelines, hands hovering near their belts, now took tentative steps toward Lawson, their faces etched with uncertainty. They'd seen it all, how effortlessly Evelyn had turned his aggression into his defeat, how she'd embodied a composure he'd abandoned the moment he crossed the line. She hadn't just bested him physically, she'd exposed the fragility of his authority, and they couldn't unsee it. Evelyn stood over him, her gaze steady and unflinching as she looked down at the man sprawled at her feet. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of gloating, only a quiet, resolute clarity. "This is on you, officer," she said, her voice cutting through the clamor with a calm certainty. "You brought this on yourself." The words landed like stones, heavy with truth. And Lawson's chest heaved harder, his breaths ragged as he glared up at her. The fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed, it blazed hotter now, fueled by humiliation, but his body betrayed him, trembling as he fumbled for his radio. "I need backup," he barked into it, his voice strained and cracking with desperation. "I'm under attack." The plea was frantic, a last-ditch effort to rewrite the narrative, but it rang hollow against the reality everyone had witnessed. Evelyn took a slow step back, her stance relaxed yet alert, her eyes never leaving him. "You're not under attack, Lawson," she countered, her tone even but firm. "You're facing the consequences of your actions. No backup's going to erase that." Round them, the officers froze, their movements stilled by the weight of her words. Some still clung to their loyalty, their hands twitching as if itching to defend their colleague. But the shift was unmistakable. The truth stood stark and unyielding before them, and they couldn't turn away from it. Evelyn's gaze swept the park, taking in the crowd, the cameras, the shifting tide of perception. "This isn't just about one officer's abuse of power," she said, her voice rising to carry over the growing din. "This is about all of us, about accountability, about making sure no one, not even someone with a badge, gets to stand above the law." Her words settled over the park like a storm cloud, heavy and undeniable, stirring the crowd into louder murmurs. People turned to one another, their voices overlapping in a tangle of agreement and debate. Some nodded fiercely, their faces alight with conviction. Others hesitated, still grappling with the upheaval of what they'd seen. But all of them felt the shift ground beneath the old power structure trembling. As Evelyn's stand cracked it open, justice wasn't just a word anymore. It was unfolding here, raw and real. And it demanded their attention. From the edge of the crowd, a young girl named Mia watched it all, her phone still raised high. Her hands, once shaky with nerves, now held steady, her grip firm as she recorded every second. Her wide eyes shimmered not with fear, but with something new, something bright and fragile, hope. She'd been there from the start, a quiet observer dwarfed by the chaos, her slight frame nearly lost among the taller figures pressing in around her. But now, as she stood on her tiptoes to keep Evelyn in frame, there was a spark in her posture, a dawning realization that she wasn't just a bystander anymore. Evelyn caught her eye and offered a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that rippled through Mia like a warm current. This wasn't just a fight, it was a lesson. One Mia was absorbing with every beat of her racing heart. "This is going to change everything," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible, yet brimming with a quiet awe that belied her years. The air shifted again as sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Backup was coming, summoned by Lawson's desperate call, and the crowd's energy surged in response. Phones stayed aloft, their screens glowing as they broadcast the scene to the world beyond the park. The arriving officers spilled from their cars, their boots hitting the ground with purpose, hands hovering near their holsters as they scanned the chaotic tableau. They'd come expecting a brawl, a clear enemy to subdue, but what they found stopped them short. Lawson lay groaning on the pavement, his uniform rumpled and his authority in tatters, while Evelyn stood calm and composed, her arms loose at her sides, her presence radiating a quiet strength that defied their expectations. The lead officer, a tall man with a weathered face and eyes sharp as flint, stepped forward. His graying hair caught the sunlight, and the lines etched into his skin spoke of years spent navigating moments like this. He sized up the scene with a practiced sweep. Lawson's sprawled form, Evelyn's unyielding stance, the crowd pulsing with restless anticipation. He didn't rush to act. Instead, he let the weight of it all settle, his gaze lingering on Lawson not as a commander, but as a man who'd overstepped and fallen hard. When his eyes met Evelyn's, there was a flicker of recognition, a silent understanding that this wasn't about sides, it was about right and wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, but Lawson's hoarse shout cut through the air. "Get me up. I'm in charge here. This is a mistake." The words were laced with rage, but a tremor undercut them, a crack in the bravado that revealed the fear gnawing at him. The older officer hesitated, his jaw tightening as he glanced back at Lawson. The crowd's soft chant grew louder, a wave of voices rising in support of Evelyn, and it tipped the scales. This wasn't just a scuffle in a park, it was a reckoning. Lawson's abuse of power had been laid bare, and the consequences were crashing down around him, unyielding as gravity. Evelyn didn't need the crowd's cheers or the officer's approval. She'd done what was right, and that was enough. As she turned to walk away, the murmurs of support trailed after her, swelling into a tide that carried her forward. The park thrummed with tension and possibility, a testament to the fragile, fierce beauty of justice taking root where power had once run unchecked. The man who had loomed so large and menacing just hours before now stood diminished, a mere shadow of the intimidating figure he once was. Officer Lawson's broad shoulders slumped as he scrambled to regain the authority that had once felt so unshakable, now slipping through his fingers like sand carried off by a relentless wind. His voice, once commanding, cracked with desperation as he barked at the crowd and the officers around him. But it was a hollow sound, lacking the weight it had once carried. His eyes darted wildly, searching for an anchor, something or someone pulled him back from the abyss he felt himself tumbling into. The power he had wielded so carelessly was gone, and the realization gnawed at him, twisting his gut with a mix of fury and fear. The officer standing closest to him, a weary man with a stern face weathered by years on the force, didn't flinch at Lawson's outburst. His gaze remained fixed on Evelyn, unwavering, as though she held the key to unraveling this chaotic scene. His hands rested calmly at his sides, but there was a subtle tension in his posture, a quiet readiness, like a coiled spring waiting for her to signal the next move. He didn't speak, didn't react to Lawson's bluster. He simply watched Evelyn, his expression unreadable yet heavy with anticipation. Around them, the air crackled with unspoken questions, the park's open expanse amplifying every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the murmurs of the growing crowdle of it underscoring the weight of this moment. Evelyn, though, was a pillar of stillness amid the storm. She didn't raise her voice or fling accusations. She didn't need to. Her presence alone commanded attention, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Lawson's unraveling. She stood rooted to the ground, her feet planted firmly on the patchy grass of the park, her dark hair catching the late afternoon light as a soft breeze tugged at its strands. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Lawson with a focus that seemed to pierce straight through him. When she finally spoke, her voice sliced through the tension like a blade through silk, clear and deliberate. "Officer Lawson," she said, her tone steady but carrying an edge of quiet authority. "You can yell all you want. You can point fingers and try to dodge what's coming, but it won't change a thing. The truth is out there now. The crowd saw it all unfold with their own eyes. The footage is spreading online faster than you can blink, and no amount of shouting is going to erase that. It's time for you to face what you've done." For a fleeting moment, the officer who had stepped forward earlier, a younger man with a lean build and nervous energy, froze, caught in a tangle of conflicting impulses. His hand twitched toward his holster, a reflexive gesture born of habit and uncertainty. His fingers hovering just above the grip of his weapon. His brow furrowed, sweat beading along his hairline as he wrestled with the gravity of the situation. He glanced at Lawson, then back at Evelyn, his chest rising and falling with shallow, uneven breaths. The confidence he'd carried earlier had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing doubt that tugged at his conscience. He exhaled sharply, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of his indecision, and let his hand fall limply to his side. His eyes flicked toward his fellow officers, seeking some unspoken cue, and in that moment, it became clear the tide was turning, and he wasn't the only one feeling it. The younger officers, who had lingered on the fringes of the confrontation, began to shift uncomfortably. Their boots scuffed against the dirt as they edged backward, their once steady gazes now clouded with uncertainty. These were men and women barely out of the academy, their uniforms still crisp, their faces unlined by the cynicism that often came with time on the job. They had stood by Lawson earlier, bolstered by the camaraderie of the badge. But now that foundation was crumbling, one of them, a lanky officer with wide, expressive eyes, met Evelyn's gaze and held it for a heartbeat longer than the others. Regret flickered across his features, etching lines of guilt into his youthful face. We should have done this differently," he muttered, his voice so soft it nearly dissolved into the breeze. But Evelyn heard him, and her response was gentle yet firm, a lifeline extended to a man drowning in his own misgivings. "It's not too late to choose the right path," she said, a warmth threading through her words that hadn't been there before. "But you have to decide now." Lawson, meanwhile, was spiraling. His muttered curses grew louder, his fists clenching as he struggled to hoist himself up from the ground where he'd stumbled. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, was now streaked with dirt, the fabric rumpled and clinging to his sweat-soaked frame. He glared at the officers around him, his face contorted with disbelief and rage. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice breaking under the strain. "I'm one of you. I have rights." But his words fell flat. Swallowed by the shifting mood of the scene, Evelyn didn't dignify his outburst with a reply. She didn't need to. The truth had already taken root, and the officers were moving now, their steps slow but purposeful as they closed in on Lawson. There was no rush, no violence in their approach, just a quiet, inevitable resolve. They flanked him, their shadows stretching long across the grass as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting the park in hues of gold and amber. Evelyn stepped back, her movements measured, giving the officers the space to act. She wasn't here to dominate or dictate. Her role had been to shine a light on the truth, and she'd done that with surgical precision. Now it was up to them to carry it forward. As Lawson was hauled to his feet, his wrists bound by the cold bite of handcuffs, the crowd released a collective breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Some erupted into cheers, their voices rising in a triumphant crescendo, while others shouted for justice, their cries raw with emotion. The air grew thick with the weight of what had just transpired, not just the fall of one man, but the cracking open of something far bigger. This wasn't merely about Lawson's reckoning, it was a lesson in justice, a stark reminder that power, when abused, carried consequences that could ripple far beyond a single moment. The park itself seemed to transform in the wake of Lawson's arrest. The tension that had buzzed through the air like static dissipated, replaced by a strange, electric energy relief tinged with exhilaration, a flicker of hope igniting in the faces of the onlookers. Children who had clung to their parents' legs now peered out with wide eyes, sensing the shift even if they couldn't grasp its full meaning. The trees lining the park swayed gently, their branches whispering against one another as if in approval of what had unfolded. But Evelyn didn't let herself bask in the moment. Her jaw remained set, her mind already racing toward what came next. She knew this was no tidy conclusion, no final chapter, just a pivot point in a much larger story. The officers who had backed Lawson weren't off the hook. They were only beginning to grapple with the magnitude of their complicity. The young officer who had spoken earlier approached her again, his steps tentative, his hands still trembling faintly at his sides. He was barely more than a kid, his face smooth and unscarred, but his eyes carried a depth of sorrow that belied his age. "I didn't know it was like this," he confessed, his voice a fragile thread. "I didn't see it not until you made me look." Evelyn offered him a small, understanding smile, her expression softening as she took in his turmoil. "It's hard to see the cracks when you're taught to trust the system blindly," she said, her tone kind but unflinching. "But you saw it now. You chose to act. That's what counts." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground as he absorbed her words, his shoulders hunching slightly under the weight of his decision. This moment would define him. She knew whether he rose to meet it or let it break him was up to him. The other officers lingered at a distance, their faces a gallery of conflicting emotions. Some wore masks of doubt, their eyes darting between Lawson's retreating figure and the crowd pressing in around them. Others stood rigid, their lips pressed into thin lines as they tried to reconcile the loyalty they'd once felt with the reality now staring them in the face. One of them, a grizzled man in his mid-30s with a jaw like granite, finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice low and rough, as though the question had been clawing at him for hours. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes steady and piercing. "Now you choose," she said simply. "You can keep hiding behind that badge, pretending you didn't see what happened here. Or you can step up and be part of something better. It's your call." The man's face tightened, his brow creasing as he wrestled with her words. The crowd fell silent, their collective breath held as they watched this exchange, sensing its significance. Even the wind seemed to pause, the leaves stilling for a moment as if the world itself waited for his response. Finally, he straightened, his jaw clenching with resolve. "I'm done standing by," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "I won't pretend this didn't happen. It wasn't a grand proclamation, but it was enough of fracture in the wall of silence that had protected men like Lawson for too long." Evelyn nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "That's a start," she said, her voice carrying a quiet encouragement. "It's not easy, but it's the only way forward." The crowd erupted then, a wave of applause rolling through the park like thunder. It wasn't just for Evelyn, though her courage had sparked this reckoning. It was for the officers who had faced the truth, for the young man trembling with the weight of his choice, for every soul who had witnessed this stand against injustice. Lawson's muttered protests faded as he was led to the waiting patrol car, his head bowed, his once proud stride reduced to a shuffle. But Evelyn's focus wasn't on him anymore. She turned to the crowd, to the officers, to the future stretching out before them. This was a victory, yes, but it was also a challenge, a promise that justice could prevail, that the misuse of power could be met with consequences, and that one voice, steady and true, could shift the course of everything. The deed was done, the veil lifted, and the raw, unfiltered truth now lay bare for all to see. There was no turning back, no way to unring the bell that had tolled so loudly across the park that afternoon. As the police cars rolled away, their flashing lights cutting through the fading daylight, a palpable shift rippled through the gathered crowd. Some began to drift off, their footsteps hesitant as they wandered back to their everyday lives, while others lingered, huddling in small clusters. Their voices buzzed softly, a mix of disbelief, excitement, and something heavier, perhaps the weight of realization as they pieced together the whirlwind of events they'd just witnessed. The air was thick with emotions, shock that such corruption had been laid bare, relief that justice had finally cracked through the surface, and a fragile, budding hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different now. Mia stood apart from the others, her phone trembling slightly in her hands as she lowered it. The recording finally stopped. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her chest tight with the aftershocks of what she'd captured. She was still reeling, her mind racing to process the chaos that had unfolded before her lens. But beneath the tremor in her limbs, a quiet awe began to bloom. Her wide eyes flickered with something new, something alive and unshakable. She'd seen history shift today, a moment so profound it etched itself into her very being, and she knew she'd carry it with her forever. Evelyn's voice still echoed in her ears, those fierce, unwavering words slicing through the tension like a blade. It wasn't just what Evelyn had said, but how she'd stood there unyielding, a lone figure against a system that had loomed so large and untouchable. That courage had sparked something deep within Mia, a feeling she couldn't yet name, but could feel pulsing through her veins. She glanced up at Evelyn, who stood a few paces away, her silhouette framed against the golden hues of the setting sun. Mia's lips parted, her voice barely a breath as it slipped out. "Thank you," she whispered, the words simple yet heavy with everything she couldn't say. Gratitude for the courage, the clarity, the push she hadn't known she needed. Evelyn turned to her, and for a moment, the hard edges of her expression softened, her eyes catching the light in a way that made them seem almost tender. "You don't have to thank me," she replied, her voice low and steady, carrying a warmth that belied the steel beneath it. "Just hold on to this. Your voice, it matters more than you know. Don't ever let yourself forget that." With those words hanging in the air, Evelyn turned and began to walk away, her steps deliberate, her posture resolute. She didn't glance back, didn't need to. Her purpose here was fulfilled. She had planted a seed, struck a match, and set something unstoppable in motion. The park might quiet down, but the echoes of her stand would reverberate far beyond this fleeting moment. As Evelyn moved through the thinning crowd, the park began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. The hum of distant traffic mingled with the rustle of leaves overhead, and the sharp wail of sirens faded into memory. Yet, for those who'd stood witness, the world felt irrevocably altered. The truth, once a buried whisper, had roared into the open, and its unveiling had shifted something fundamental in the air. The crowd's earlier tension had dissolved into a mosaic of reactions, some spoken hushed tones. Their heads bent close as they dissected what they'd seen, while others stood silently, staring into the distance as if trying to reconcile the day's events with the lives they'd known before. There was relief, yes, and a taste of justice that had seemed so elusive just hours ago. But beneath it all ran a current of something more potent, though raw and unpolished, threading its way through every heart that had stayed to see this through. Evelyn paused at the edge of the gathering, her gaze sweeping over the scene one last time. Her shoulders bore the invisible weight of the day, a burden she carried without complaint. Her work here was done, but she knew this was merely a chapter's end, not the story's. The consequences of this moment would stretch far beyond the grassy expanse of the park, beyond the golden light of this single afternoon. She could feel its ripples spreading outward, touching lives she'd never know, challenging a system that had grown too comfortable in its abuses. Justice had prevailed today, but it was a fragile victory, one that demanded vigilance to sustain. She exhaled slowly, her breath mingling with the cool evening air, and let her eyes drift to the horizon. There was no time to linger in triumph. The fight was far from over. Behind her, the crowd's whispers floated like leaves on the wind, soft and reverent. Words like courage and bravery danced through the conversations, spoken with a quiet awe that bordered on worship. But Evelyn didn't bask in it. To her, this wasn't about personal glory, it was about the people who'd found their voices, who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with her when the moment demanded it. Mia, still hovering near the fringes, was proof of that. The young girl stepped forward now, her sneakers scuffing against the worn path as she approached Evelyn again. Her face was a canvas of emotion's admiration painted in the upward tilt of her lips, but something else too, a newfound strength flickering in her eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but laced with worry. She studied Evelyn's face, searching for cracks in the armor, as if needing to know this towering figure was still human beneath it all. Evelyn's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, the kind that carried the weight of countless battles. "I'm fine," she said, her tone light but firm. "I've weathered worse storms than this." She paused, her gaze softening as it settled on Mia. "What about you? How are you holding up after all this?" Mia dropped her eyes to the ground, her fingers twisting together as she grappled with her thoughts. The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then she lifted her head, and there it was, a spark, bright and undeniable, illuminating her features. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I could matter, that something like this could actually change anything." Evelyn's smile widened, a warmth spreading through her chest at the girl's words. She reached out, resting a steady hand on Mia's shoulder. "You can," she said, her tone resolute. "You already have. Don't ever let doubt tell you otherwise." Mia's face brightened, the gravity of Evelyn's words sinking deep into her core. "Thank you," she murmured again, her voice thick with emotion. Evelyn shook her head. her expression turning serious. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. You stood up. You hit record. You spoke out. That's where the change starts, right there, with you." They stood together for a moment, the world around them fading into a soft blur as the reality of the day settled over them. Like a mantle. Nearby, Officer Lawson's fate had been sealed, his wrists bound in cuffs. His once imposing figure diminished as he was ushered into the back of a squad car. The crowd had watched, breathless, as his authority crumbled. His reign of fear and manipulation reduced to dust. Frustration twisted his features, fear glinting in his eyes as he was driven away, the last vestiges of his power slipping through his fingers like sand. Justice, so long a distant dream, had arrived in sharp, unyielding clarity. Across the park, the officers who'd once stood in Lawson's shadow lingered in a tight knot, their voices low and uncertain, their broad shoulders slumped now, the swagger that had defined them earlier replaced by a quiet unease. Evelyn could see them through the thinning crowd, their heads bowed as they murmured among themselves. The tension that had bound them as a unit had unraveled, leaving them to question not just Lawson, but themselves. Were they complicit? Could they have acted sooner? The answers eluded them, but the doubt was evident in their shifting stances, the way they avoided meeting each other's eyes. One younger officer, the same one who'd faltered earlier when the confrontation peaked, caught Evelyn's gaze across the distance. His face remained still, no smile or gesture offered, but his eyes spoke volumes, a storm of regret and awakening brewing within them. He wasn't the man who'd arrived at the park that day. Something had shifted, cracked open, and Evelyn knew he'd carry that change with him long after the dust settled. As she turned to leave, a light tap on her shoulder stopped her. She pivoted to find an older officer standing there, his weathered face a mask of conflicted emotions. He'd been a silent observer through most of the ordeal, his presence steady but uninvolved. Now, though, there was a softness in his posture, a crack in the hard shell he'd worn so long. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice rough but earnest, barely audible over the evening breeze. "I didn't see it, not until now." Evelyn nodded, unsurprised. The truth had a way of piercing even the thickest armor, given time. "It's not too late to do better," she replied simply, her tone calm but firm. "You've already started by saying that." He stood there, absorbing her words, his jaw tightening with a mix of guilt and determination. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Not while I'm around." Evelyn offered a small nod, acknowledging the pledge. It was enough to cross a line today, from bystander to someone who'd chosen a side. That was a beginning. Stepping away, Evelyn felt the weight of countless eyes on her, but it wasn't suffocating. They watched not out of judgment, but reverence, because they'd seen something rare and real unfold before them. Justice had moved from an abstract hope to a tangible force, flawed and incomplete, but present. The park grew still, the chaos giving way to a quiet that felt earned. Like the calm after a tempest, leaves whispered in the trees, voices hummed faintly in the distance, and Evelyn let it all wash over her. She didn't linger to soak in the aftermath. The role was done. The torch passed to those who'd witnessed it, to the system that would have to reckon with its flaws, to Mia and the others who'd found their voices. With a final glance at the emptying park, she turned and walked away, her stride unwavering. She'd made a dent today, but the work was endless. Truth, once unleashed, didn't retreat, it demanded to be faced. The park slowly reclaimed its peace as the last stragglers drifted off, laughter and chatter filtering back into the air like a melody resuming after a pause. Children darted across the grass, oblivious to the weight of what had transpired, while the adults moved with a subtle difference, a quiet resolve, a spark of possibility. For those who'd seen it all, the world had tilted on its axis, and there was no going back. Evelyn paused at the park's edge, her eyes tracing the figures still milling about. The officers lingered, their hushed conversations a testament to the unease settling into their ranks. Change wouldn't come swiftly, she knew that, but it had begun a slow, tectonic shift born from accountability, from the collective will of those who'd refused to look away. And though she'd been the spark, the real power lay in the voices that had risen with her, in Mia's trembling hands that had captured it all, in the crowd that had dared to believe justice wasn't just a word, but a force worth fighting for. In the stillness of a suburban evening, something remarkable was unfolding. A transformation so profound it seemed to ripple through the air. Mia stood in the park, her once shaky hands now clutching her phone with a fierce, unshakable resolve. The tremble that had defined her fingers earlier that day had vanished, replaced by a steady grip that mirrored the fire igniting within her. Her eyes, which had once darted nervously, avoiding confrontation, now burned with a clarity and strength she hadn't known she possessed. The cool breeze brushed against her skin, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of a world settling into dusk. She felt the weight of the moment pressing into her chest, not as a burden, but as a call to rise. Evelyn approached her then, her silhouette cutting through the fading light like a beacon of quiet authority. The older woman's boots crunched softly against the gravel path, each step deliberate, as if she were measuring the gravity of what had just transpired. She stopped beside Mia, her presence warm yet commanding, and placed a gentle hand on the younger woman's shoulder. The touch was light, but it carried the weight of reassurance, grounding Mia in the midst of her newfound courage. "How are you holding up?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft but laced with genuine concern, the kind that invited honesty rather than demanded it. Mia turned her head slightly, meeting Evelyn's gaze. A smile tugged at her lips, tentative at first, then blooming into something radiant. "I'm okay," she said, her voice steady, a stark contrast to the quiver it had held hours before. She paused, her breath catching as she searched for the right words. "No, I'm more than okay." Her eyes drifted to the park around them, now cloaked in the hush of evening. The chaos of earlier raised voices, the tension, the clash of willshed dissipated, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred. "I think I get it now," she continued, her tone growing firmer with each syllable. "It's not just about standing up when everyone's watching. It's about what comes after, about keeping the change alive, even when the spotlight fades." Evelyn's expression softened, her eyes crinkling at the corners with a mixture of pride and understanding. She gave me a small, approving nod, her silver hair catching the last glints of sunlight. "You've got it," she said, her voice rich with conviction. "It's not just about this one day. It's about how you carry your voice forward, how you keep fighting for what's right, no matter who's around to see it. And you don't have to do it alone, you never will." Her words hung in the air, a promise woven into the fabric of the moment, and Mia felt them settle deep within her, like roots taking hold in fertile soil. Mia's smile widened, her confidence swelling with every breath. She straightened her shoulders, standing a little taller under Evelyn's steady gaze. "I won't forget this," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet determination. "I won't forget what it means to be prevented just for myself, but for everyone who needs someone to speak up." Evelyn paused, her hands still resting on Mia's shoulder, and for a moment, the two women stood in companionable silence, the park stretching out around them like a canvas painted with possibility. "And I'll never forget that you were part of this," Evelyn replied after a beat, her tone softening with a rare vulnerability. "It's people like you, Maya Popel, with heart and grit will keep this momentum alive. Don't ever lose sight of that." As they stood there, the park began to reclaim its old familiarity. Families trickled away, their footsteps fading into the dusk, children's laughter echoing faintly as they headed home. But something lingered in the air, something intangible yet undeniably spark of change that clung to every blade of grass, every rustling leaf. The memory of what had unfolded that day would stay with those who'd witnessed it, a silent reminder that truth, once unleashed, held the power to reshape the world. Evelyn turned to leave, her stride steady and purposeful, her shadow stretching long across the path. But before she disappeared into the twilight, she paused, her instincts pulling her back to the camera that had captured it all. It stood there, a silent sentinel, its lens trained on the scene like an unblinking eye. She faced it squarely, her posture unwavering, and spoke directly to the invisible audience beyond the screen. "You've just seen a moment of change unfold," she began, her voice cutting through the quiet with a clarity that demanded attention. The camera zoomed in, framing her weathered face lines etched by years of battles fought and lessons learned. What happened here wasn't just about one officer's mistake. It was about accountability. It was about standing up for what's right, even when the odds feel insurmountable. Her chest rose as she drew a deep breath, her eyes locking with the lens as if she could see every soul watching from afar. The truth is, every single one of us has that power to speak, to act, to make the world better, one step at a time. This story doesn't end here. The fight for justice is a long road, but every time we stand up, every time we challenge the system, we push forward. And that progress, it starts with you. Her voice grew urgent, insistent, pulling the listener into the heart of her message. So tell me, what do you think? What's your take on what you've just seen? How do you feel about what happened here? About the choices we made? Share your thoughts below. Let's keep this conversation alive, because your voice, it matters more than you know. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then the faintest smile curved her lips, a glimmer of hope breaking through her stern resolve. And if you believe in this, if you believe in the power of standing up, don't just sit there. Share this story. Subscribe. Every share, every new voice, keeps this fire burning, spreading courage and change to corners we can't even imagine. We're in this together. With that, Evelyn stepped back, her gaze lingering on the park one last time. The horizon swallowed the sun, casting the world in hues of amber and violet, and she walked off into the distance, her figure fading until she was little more than a silhouette against the sky. A whisper carried on the wind. Justice begins with one voice. Far from the park, in the quiet of a suburban street, another scene was brewing, gone, that would echo the same lessons of courage and consequence. Detective Naomi Harper leaned against her car, a sleek black sedan that gleamed faintly under the streetlights. Its unassuming exterior hid a trove of cutting-edge gear within, a testament to her years as one of the city's sharpest minds. She'd been here before too many times, in fact chasing leads through neighborhoods that slept while the world turned. It was late now, the air thick with the stillness of night, and long shadows stretched across the pavement, cast by the flickering glow of sodium lamps. She'd just finished questioning a witness for a high-stakes case, her notebook open under the dim light inside her car, her pen scratching notes in a shorthand only she could decipher. Then, a flash of red and blue pierced the darkness, flooding her rearview mirror with an all-too-familiar glare. A cruiser rolled up behind her, its engine growling softly before cutting off. Out stepped Officer Daniels, a hulking figure whose swagger oozed with the kind of authority that didn't a skit demanded. His hand rested casually on his holstered gun, a silent threat wrapped in routine, and his face bore a thin-lipped smirk that Naomi had seen one too many times. "License and registration," he barked, his voice thick with accusation, as if he'd already decided her guilt before she could open her mouth. Naomi tilted her head, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Excuse me," she said, her tone calm but edged with a quiet challenge. Daniels didn't flinch. "This is a suspicious vehicle in a residential area. Hand over your ID," he demanded, his words clipped and heavy. Her fingers tightened around her notebook, the leather cover creaking under her grip, but her face remained a mask of composure. She knew this dance of posturing, the power play. "Suspicious, huh?" she replied, her voice steady but pointed. "Mind explaining how?" Daniels leaned in, his bulk shadowing the window as he scanned her car's interior with exaggerated scrutiny. "You're parked outside a house that doesn't belong to you," he said, his tone dripping with insinuation. "Let me guess, casing the joint." Naomi raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement dancing beneath her calm exterior. Inside, though, a fire simmered, fueled by years of dealing with men like him and who saw her skin, her presence, and built a story before she could even speak. "Casing," she echoed, her voice dry. "You've got an overactive imagination, officer." His smirk hardened, turning cold. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand twitching toward his weapon. She didn't move, not yet. Instead, a faint smile played on her lips as her hand slid to her waist. Not for a gun, but for something far more potent. She kept it hidden for now, savoring the moment. "You're making a mistake," she said, her words smooth and deliberate. Daniels's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying. "I said step out," he snapped, the tension crackling between them like a live wire. Naomi exhaled slowly, her decision made. She opened the door and stepped out, her movements measured, her tall frame unfolding with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space around her. Her polished shoes clicked against the asphalt, each sound a small defiance. She stood straight, her tailored blazer catching the light, her dark skin glowing under the street lamp's harsh glare. Daniels sized her up, his gaze lingering on her with a mix of suspicion and disdain. He took a step back, his smirk twisting into something uglier. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, his voice sharp enough to cut. Naomi raised her hands slightly, palms open, but her eyes never wavered from his. She saw the game he was playing the way he leaned into his authority, itching for her to cower, to shrink under his stare. But Naomi Harper didn't shrink. "Officer Daniels, isn't it?" she asked, her voice cool but laced with a steel that made him pause. His brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his broad face. "How do you know my name?" She tilted her head, her smile sharpening. "You've built quite the reputation around here," she said, "harassing people who don't look like they belong. Sound familiar?" Daniels stiffened, his jaw clenching as her words hit their mark. "Watch your tone," he growled, his pride bristling. Naomi let her hands fall to her sides, her stance unshaken. "My tone," she said, stepping closer, her gaze piercing. "Funny you was about to say the same about yours. Do you even know who you're talking to?" Daniels sneered, his condescension rolling off him in waves. "A suspicious individual in a nice car, parked outside a house that doesn't belong to her. Care to explain that?" Naomi's chuckle was soft, but biting, a sound that grated on his nerves. She reached into her blazer pocket, her movements slow and deliberate, and Daniels tensed, his hand darting to his gun. "Relax," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm just grabbing something you'll want to see." She pulled out a leather case and flipped it open, holding it up so the badge inside caught the light. "Detective Naomi Harper, Major Crimes Division," she announced, her tone icy and unyielding. Daniels froze, his arrogance crumbling into stunned silence. "Oh, and for the record," she added, leaning in slightly, "that house, it's mine. My name's on the deed. Want a check?" His mouth opened, then closed, his face flushing as he grappled with the shift. Naomi didn't let up. "I suggest you think hard about your next move, Officer Daniels," she said, her voice low and lethal. "Because it's not looking good for you." The power had flipped, and Daniels felt his bravado unraveling under her steady gaze. But Naomi wasn't finished. She crossed her arms, her presence towering. "You should have identified yourself sooner," he muttered, scrambling to regain ground. "Identified myself," she shot back, her eyebrow arching. "I didn't realize sitting in my own car required a press release. Or is that just for people who look like me?" Her words stung, and Daniels flinched, his defensiveness flaring. "I'm just doing my job," he snapped. "High alert area break-ins lately. You understand." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line, her calm sharpening into something razor-edged. "Let me get this straight," she said, stepping closer, her voice slicing through the night. "You saw me sitting here, minding my business, and decided I was a threat not because of anything I did, but because of where I was and how I look. Is that it?" Daniels faltered, his excuses crumbling under the weight of her truth. In that moment, the lesson crystallized. Power, unchecked, bred in justice but courage, wielded with purpose, could tear it down. The night air hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken tension as Officer Daniels stood rooted to the spot, his eyes darting nervously anywhere but at her. Naomi's voice sliced through the silence, sharp and unyielding. "Answer me, officer," she demanded, her tone carrying the weight of years spent commanding respect in a world that often refused to give it. Daniels opened his mouth, hesitated, then faltered, his words dissolving into the cool breeze. Finally, he mumbled something barely audible, a feeble attempt at deflection. "It's procedure." Naomi's laugh broke the stillness, a low, bitter sound that echoed off the dimly lit street, devoid of any trace of humor. "Procedure," she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain as she took a deliberate step closer, her shadow stretching long and imposing under the flickering street lamp. "Let me tell you something about procedure, Officer Daniels. Procedure is upholding the law with integrity. Procedure is treating every single person you encounter, every citizen, with dignity and respect, until you've got a damn good reason not to. What you're doing here, this isn't procedure. This is profiling, plain and simple." Her words landed like a hammer. and Daniel's cheeks flushed a deeper shade of red, the color creeping up his neck as he crossed his arms tightly over his chest, a flimsy shield against the truth she wielded. He squared his shoulders, clinging to the last scraps of his authority. "Look, detective," he snapped, his voice clipped and brittle. "You might outrank me, but this isn't about you. It's about keeping this neighborhood safe." The defiance in his tone was hollow, and Naomi could hear a tremor beneath his bravado. Her eyes narrowed, dark and piercing, as she closed the distance between them, her presence radiating a quiet fury that made the air feel charged. "Safe," she shot back, her voice low but laced with steel. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you're keeping people safe by zeroing in on someone without a shred of cause? Or is it more about keeping people like me, people who don't fit your picture of who belongs out of your little bubble?" Daniels shifted his weight, his boots scuffing against the cracked pavement, but he couldn't hide the discomfort creeping into his posture. Naomi pressed on, relentless. "Tell me, officer, how many people have you stopped tonight? How many drivers have you pulled over, questioned, hassle drivers, who didn't look like me?" She let the question linger, heavy and accusing, daring him to fill the silence. Daniel's mouth twitched open, then snapped shut, his jaw tightening as the weight of her words pinned him in place. The absence of an answer spoke louder than any excuse he could muster. Naomi straightened to her full height, her authority filling the space like a storm cloud rolling in. "Let me jog your memory. Officer Daniels," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "I'm not just some detective you can brush off. I'm a detective with a record so clean it shines. And I've got internal affairs on speed dial. So unless you want me to sit down and draft a formal report about this charming little stop complete, with every detail of your so-called procedure, I suggest you start rethinking your approach. Right now." Daniels blinked, his resolve crumbling under the gravity of her threat. But Naomi wasn't finished. She could see the cracks forming in his armor, and she intended to widen them. His shoulders stiffened, a last-ditch effort to hold his ground, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering toward the shadows as if searching for an escape from the reckoning unfolding before him. Naomi's voice cut through the night again, calm and unshakable. "I could stand here until dawn, listing every violation you've racked up tonight. Unjustified stop, harassment, abuse of authority. Do you have any idea what those look like on paper when internal affairs gets a hold of them? Because I do. I've written reports like that before, and let me tell you, they don't end with a pat on the back for officers like you." Daniels shifted uneasily, his fingers flexing at his sides as his confidence eroded, grain by grain. Yet his pride clung on, stubborn and frayed. "Look, Detective Harper," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with uncertainty. "If you think I overstepped, I'm sorry you feel that way. But you've got to understand we're under a lot of pressure out here. This job isn't easy." Naomi stared at him, her expression unreadable, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. Then, to his surprise, a faint smile curved her lips, and it warm, not kind, but sharp and knowing. A blade disguised as a gesture. "A tough job," she echoed, her voice soft but cutting like a razor's edge. "You think you know pressure? Let me paint you a picture of what pressure really is." She stepped closer, her presence towering over him despite their near-identical height, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him flinch. "Pressure is clawing your way up in a system that's rigged to question your every move. It's solving high-profile cases that land on the front page while half the room still whispers, 'You don't belong there.' It's knowing that no matter how flawless your work is, someone like Yusumi with a badge and a chip on their shoulder might pull me over one night and see a suspect instead of a person." Daniel's mouth tightened into a thin line, but he didn't dare interrupt. Naomi's voice grew stronger, each word a brick in the wall she was building around him. "But here's the thing about pressure, Daniels, it doesn't crush me. It hones me. It sharpens me into something you can't ignore. That's why I'm standing here, badge in hand, while you're scrambling to justify the biases you wear like a second skin." His jaw clenched, and for a fleeting moment, Naomi thought he might push back. Instead, his gaze darted to his cruiser, a silent wish for retreat flickering in his eyes. "Not so fast," she said, her tone snapping him back to attention, cold and unyielding. "We're not done here." Daniels turned slowly, his face a war zone of defiance and resignation. Naomi reached into her pocket with deliberate calm. Pulling out a slim tablet that glinted under the streetlight, she tapped the screen a few times, her movements precise, then turned it toward him. "Take a look at this," she said, her voice slicing through the quiet. "It's a log of every stop you've made in the last month. Want to take a stab at what I found?" His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic breaking through his mask, but he stayed silent. Naomi didn't wait for a response. 80%, she said, her words ringing out like a gavel. 80% of the people you've pulled over are black or Hispanic, in a neighborhood that's 60% white. Care to explain that math to me, officer? Daniels swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as the last of his bravado melted away, leaving only unease in its wake. Naomi let the silence stretch, her gaze unrelenting, pinning him like a specimen under glass. "That's what I thought," she said finally, her voice low and lethal. He opened his mouth, fumbling for anything to say, but she raised a hand, cutting him off before he could start. "Save it. I don't want excuses. I want change. And trust me, Daniels, by the time I'm through with you, you'll wish you'd never laid eyes on this car." She paced slowly, her boots clicking against the asphalt, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm of consequences she was unleashing. "Do you have any idea what happens when someone like me files a report against someone like you?" she asked, her tone almost casual, but laced with a deadly undercurrent. "It's not just a reprimand or a stern note from your captain. It's an investigation, body cam footage pulled, community complaints dusted off, patterns of behavior dissected under a microscope." Daniel's lips parted, a protest forming, but her sharp glance silenced him. "And when those patterns show what I know, they will a trail of targeting people of color. Baseless stops, maybe even incidents buried in the paperwork. You won't just be the precinct's problem child. You'll be a liability." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper, each word heavy with intent. "Liabilities don't just get demoted, they get fired, they lose pensions. They end up standing before a disciplinary board with nothing left but a badge they never earned." Daniel's eyes flicked to the badge clipped to her waist, its metallic gleam a silent rebuke. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic weaving through the city, and Naomi let the moment stretch, the weight of her words sinking deep into his bones. "Here's the thing, Daniels," she said, pointing at him with a steady, deliberate finger. "I'm not just a detective. I'm someone who believes in accountability. And you've been ducking it for far too long." His voice cracked as he spoke, shaky and small. "To didn't mean anything by it. It's just the job." Naomi's eyes flashed, her patience thinning. "Just the job?" she snapped, her voice rising for the first time, a controlled burst of fire. "Just following orders? Just another night of profiling, because it's easier than doing real police work?" Daniels flinched, his face crumpling under the heat of her stare. "Let me tell you something," she continued, her tone softening but losing none of its power. "You're not just a bad cop. You're a dangerous one. Every time you let your biases steer your decisions. You're not safeguarding this community, you're ripping it apart, piece by piece." She straightened, her resolve ironclad. "And that ends tonight, because if you think I'm walking away from this quietly, you're dead wrong. I've seen too many officers like Yao hiding behind their badges to excuse their ignorance. But not anymore." The tension between them crackled, thick and electric. Daniel stood frozen, his hand twitching near his utility belt, not a threat, but a desperate grasp for control in a moment that had slipped through his fingers. Naomi caught the movement, and for a heartbeat, a flicker of pity crossed her mind. "You know," she said, her voice measured and reflective, "you remind me of someone. Another officer I crossed paths with years ago. Same swagger, same prejudices, same tired line about just doing his job." She stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. "Want to know where he is now?" Daniels said nothing, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed his curiosity. "Retired," she said, a faint smirk tugging at her lips, "not by choice. Turns out, when you build a career on profiling innocent people, and someone finally shines a light on it, your days in uniform get cut real short." She tilted her head, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I could do that to you, Daniels. One Colonetto Internal Affairs, and you'd be drowning in inquiries for months. Your name would be a stain across the department, your reputation shredded. You'd be lucky to land a gig watching parking lots by the time I'm done." His face paled, the last vestiges of his confidence draining away. "Look," he stammered, his voice trembling, "to made a mistake, okay? I get it. I'll do better." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her expression a mask of skepticism. "Do better?" She echoed, her tone laced with disbelief. "That's your fix. You think a weak apology wipes away the harm you've done to me, to the people you've targeted before tonight, to this entire community?" "I didn't mean any harm," he muttered, his eyes dropping to the ground, unable to meet hers. "Didn't mean any harm," she repeated, her voice rising again, sharp and incredulous. "Tell that to the mother whose son you humiliated in front of his friends, forced to stand there while you flexed your authority. Tell that to the father who she stopped herself, taking a breath, her composure a testament to the strength she'd forged through years of battles like this. The lesson here wasn't just for Daniels, it was bigger than him. It was about justice, about the fragile line between power and its abuse. Naomi knew that every time an officer like him acted on unchecked bias, it eroded trust, fractured communities, and left scars that lingered far beyond a single night. But she also knew that confronting it, holding it up to the light, cooled forced change, however small. Daniels might squirm, might falter, but he'd carry this moment with him. A reminder that power without accountability was a hollow shell, destined to collapse under its own weight. And as she stood there, unwavering, she embodied that truth, a living testament to the consequences of crossing that line. The air hung heavy that night, thick with tension and the faint hum of distant traffic. As Officer Daniels stood by his cruiser, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own unease. His fingers fidgeted nervously with the edge of his uniform, betraying the storm brewing inside him, clashing with a stubborn defensiveness he couldn't quite shake. The flashing red and blue lights of his patrol car cast eerie shadows across the empty street, painting the scene in a surreal glow that only amplified the gravity of the moment. Naomi, standing a few feet away, let out a slow, deliberate sigh, her breath visible in the cool night air. She took a small step back, not out of retreat, but to give him space to wrestle with the mess he'd made. Her dark eyes, sharp and unrelenting, softened just a touch as she spoke. "Here's the thing, Daniels," she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. "You're not wrong about one thing. People screw up. They stumble, they falter. But the real question, the one that matters, is what you're going to do with that mistake." Daniels lifted his gaze from the cracked pavement, his face a canvas of uncertainties darting, mouth twitching as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Naomi's tone hardened again, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Because let me tell you something," she continued, her words gaining strength. "I've got my eye on you now, and if I catch you pulling this kind of stunt again, dragging someone over the coals, for no damn Riasoni won't just scribble a report and call it a day. Oh no, I'll make it my personal mission to see that badge ripped off your chest for good." Her words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating in the stillness. Daniels felt them hit, a freight train of consequence crashing into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. He managed a weak nod, his eyes barely meeting hers, the weight of her promise sinking deep into his bones. "Understood," he muttered, his voice a low rasp, barely audible over the hum of the cruiser's engine. "Good," Naomi snapped, her tone clipped and final. She cast a quick glance at the dashboard camera perched inside his car, its little red light blinking steadily, capturing every second of their exchange. "Now why don't you climb back in that cruiser of yours," she said, gesturing with a flick of her chin, "and take a long, hard look at yourself. Figure out what kind of officer you want to be, because right now, you're heading down a path that ends in ruin." Daniels hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle, his mind racing. The night seemed to close in around him, the shadows stretching longer, the quiet amplifying his every thought. With a small, reluctant nod, he turned and reached for the door, but Naomi's voice sliced through the air one last time. "Oh, and Daniels," she called, her tone sharp enough to make him freeze. He glanced back, wary, his brow furrowed. "I'll be digging into those body cam tapes," she said, her words cold and deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Don't think for a second this is over." His jaw tightened, and with a stiff nod, he yanked the door open and slid inside, slamming it shut with a force that echoed down the empty street. As he pulled away, the red and blue lights flickered and faded into the darkness, swallowed by the night. Naomi stood there, unmoving, her silhouette tall and resolute against the dim streetlights. The adrenaline still pulsed through her veins, a steady drumbeat urging her onward. She wasn't finished at even close. Too many times, she'd watched moments like this dissolve into nothingness, swept away by apathy or bureaucracy. She'd seen officers like Daniels walk away unscathed, their egos bruised, but their habits unchanged, ready to wield their power carelessly again. Not this time. As his cruiser vanished around the corner, she took a deep breath, the crisp air filling her lungs, grounding her. The night had fallen silent once more, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. Climbing into her own car, she reached for her tablet, her fingers moving with purpose across the screen. She pulled up the police database, her detective credentials granting her access to the records she needed. Daniels wasn't some anomaly, some lone bad apple she'd crossed paths with his kind before, officers who hid behind their authority like it was a shield. But she was determined to turn him into a cautionary tale, a lesson etched in stone for anyone else tempted to abuse the trust they'd been given. The screen glowed faintly in the dim interior of her car. As she scrolled through Danielle's service record, it didn't take long for the pattern to emerge, stark and undeniable. Complaint after complaint, stiff traffic stops, excessive force, muttered slurs that reeked of prejudicial neatly filed away, stamped unsubstantiated by a system too slow or too indifferent to act. Each entry was a story, a voice silenced, a young man late to his shift because Daniels had decided to flex his authority, a teenage girl who now flinched at the sight of a uniform, her childhood innocence tainted by fear. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin, determined line as she dug deeper, her fingers flying across the tablet, flagging cases, jotting notes, cross-referencing stop logs. The numbers didn't lead as proportionate stops of minority drivers, a trail of grievances from community members who dared to speak up. She wasn't just gathering evidence, she was constructing a monument to accountability. Brick by damning brick, satisfied with her groundwork, Naomi tapped open an email draft, her mind racing as she typed. She addressed it to Internal Affairs, her captain, and the department's oversight committee names that carried weight, desks where decisions were made. Her words were precise, cutting, a call to action that left no room for excuses. But just before she hit send, she paused, her finger hovering over the screen. This wasn't just about Daniels, she realized. He was a thread in a larger tapestry, a symptom of a culture that turned a blind eye to its own rot. Justice demanded more than a single reprimand, it required a reckoning. She needed voices, witnesses, people who could breathe life into the cold data she'd compiled. Glancing at the dashboard clock, still early enough, she reached for her phone. Her first call was to Marcus Wright, a civil rights lawyer whose name carried a reputation for turning whispers of injustice into roars. His voice came through smooth and steady, a calm anchor in the storm. "Detective Harper, what's on your mind tonight?" Naomi didn't waste time. She laid it all out, the confrontation with Daniels, the evidence she'd unearthed, the pattern she couldn't unsee. Marcus listened, his silence punctuated by the occasional sharp question, his mind already turning. "This isn't just a departmental hiccup," he said when she finished, his tone grave but edged with possibility. "It's baked into the system. But if you've got the data on it, sounds like you can blow this wide open. Public hearings, media spotlight, maybe even a class action suit from the people he's hurt." Naomi felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," she replied, her voice firm. Her next calls went to community leaders, folks who'd spent years shouting into the void about police overreach. There was Lena Carter, a fiery organizer with a voice that could rally a crowd, who answered with a weary but determined, "What's the plan, Naomi?" And Jamal Hayes, a soft-spoken pastor whose congregation had borne the brunt of Danielle's stops. His quiet "I've got stories too many" sending a chill down her spine. Each one pledged their support, offering names, testimonies, connections to others who'd felt the sting of Danielle's badge. By the time she hung up, The groundwork was laid not just for a case, but for a movement. Daniels wasn't facing a slap on the wrist. He was about to become the epicenter of a citywide storm. Leaning back in her seat, Naomi's gaze drifted to the darkened street where it had all begun. The asphalt gleamed faintly under the streetlights, a silent witness to the night's drama. This wasn't just about Daniels. She reminded herself it was about the young girl trembling at the sight of a cruiser, the father who'd missed his daughter's recital because of a baseless stop, the countless others whose trust had been shattered. This time, the silence would break. By morning, the city was alive with whispers. Naomi's emails had landed like grenades on the right desks, and the fallout was swift. Internal Affairs kicked off a preliminary review of Danielle's conduct. Her captain, Reeves, a gruff man with a hidden streak of decent, cycled her personally. "This is a hell of a swing, Harper," he said, his voice a mix of caution and quiet pride. "You sure you're ready for the heat?" "Positive," she shot back, unflinching. Back at the precinct, she watched the dominoes fall. Marcus had rallied 5 community members to go publictoire with shaky cell phone footage of Daniel's barking orders, his voice dripping with disdain. Lena was already organizing a press conference, her energy electric even over the phone. Local news vans prowled the streets, sniffing out the story, while Naomi's inbox buzzed with support texts from colleagues who'd seen the same patterns. Emails from activists grateful someone was finally listening. Even a few anonymous tips about other officers worth a look. By midday, Marcus called again, his voice buzzing with urgency. "We've got a reporter from the Tribune itching to run this. They want to quote your voice, Naomi." She hesitated, the risks flashing through her mind, the inevitable backlash, the scrutiny, the whispers of traitor from the old guard. But then she thought of that girl, eyes wide with fear, and the choice was clear. "Tell them I'm in," she said, resolute. That afternoon, the journalist, a young woman named Claire with a notepad and a hunger for truth, sat across from her. In a cramped precinct office, Naomi didn't hold back. "This isn't about one rogue cop," she said, her voice steady but burning with conviction. "It's about a system that lets this behavior fester. Daniels isn't the exception, it's the product. And if we want justice, real justice, we've got to rip out the roots, not just trim the branches." Claire's pen flew across the page, her eyes gleaming with each word. "What's your hope here?" she asked, leaning in. Naomi didn't blink. "A wake-up call for the department, for the city, for everyone. Accountability isn't a luxury, it's the backbone of trust. For the people who've been hurt, for the officers who actually give a damn, for the soul of what law enforcement's supposed to be." The story hit the web that night and spread like wildfire, hashtags trending, retweets piling up, community voices rising in a chorus of enough. The news ran at prime time. Marcus's clipped commentary paired with tearful testimonies from Danielle's victims. Naomi's name was everywhere, praised by those desperate for change, cursed by those clinging to the old ways. She took it all in stride, her focus unshaken. By night's end, the tide had turned. Internal Affairs suspended Daniels, pending a full probe. The department issued a terse promise of transparency and a training overhaul. Marcus called with a grin in his voice. A council member had signed on. For a civilian oversight board. Naomi leaned back in her chair, the precinct quiet around her, and let the weight of it sink in. Justice wasn't just a punishment, it was a mirror, forcing everyone to face the cost of power misused. And as the city buzzed beyond her window, she knew this was only the beginning. The glow of the computer screen bathed her face in a soft, flickering light as her eyes darted across the cascade of notifications and updates pouring in. She sat motionless for a moment, fingers hovering over the keyboard, her breath shallow but steady. The fight was far from over. Years of struggle had taught her that victories were fleeting, unless you clawed them into permanence, but something unfamiliar stirred deep within her chest. It wasn't just determination this time, it was hope, fragile and rare, blooming like a flower pushing through cracked pavement. For Naomi Harper, a detective who'd spent countless nights chasing shadows of justice, the sensation was a quiet revolution, a whisper of possibility after years of deafening silence. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Jacob Daniels trudged into the precinct, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum floor. The weight of the previous day's fallout clung to him like damp fog hadn't seen it coming. Not like this. By the time he crossed the threshold, the air inside felt thick with judgment. His badge, once a gleaming emblem of power pinned proudly to his chest, now hung heavy, tarnished by whispers and sidelong glances. The colleagues who'd once slapped his back and chuckled at his half-baked jokes now turned away, their eyes averted as if meeting his gaze might taint them too. In the break room, he slumped into a chair, the plastic creaking under his weight, and buried his head in his hands. The murmurs of the other officers buzzed around him like Fleeshy's name, once spoken with casual camaraderie, now dripped with disdain, tied inseparably to the investigation ripping through the department like wildfire. A supervisor's summons came swiftly, cutting through the haze of his thoughts. Daniels shuffled into the office, shoulders hunched, expecting a reprimand, but not the guillotine that fell instead. The words immediate suspension landed like a punch to the gut, and his department-issued body camera and service weapon were stripped from him, confiscated as evidence in a case he could no longer pretend didn't exist. Back in the break room, he sat alone, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly as the world he'd known crumbled. "Hey, Daniels," a passing officer muttered, his voice laced with bitter satisfaction. "Guess karma finally caught up, huh?" Daniels lifted his head, his face pale and drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been yesterday. "I didn't do anything wrong," he shot back, the words tumbling out reflexively, a weak shield against the tide. But they rang hollow, even to his own ears, crumbling under the weight of the truth he'd tried to bury. Naomi's statistics gold, unyielding numbers flashed in his mind, alongside the trembling voices of community members and the grainy video clips Marcus Wright had unearthed. Together, they formed a portrait of his career he could no longer unsee, a mirror reflecting a man who'd wielded power without care. Across the city, Naomi was a whirlwind of focus, her small apartment cluttered with files, coffee cups, and scribbled notes. She wasn't content to let this moment slip away as just another notch on her belt. Craved something bigger, something lasting. The victory over Daniels was a spark, and she intended to fan it into a blaze that would reshape the system itself. That afternoon, she sat at a weathered wooden table in a community center, surrounded by Marcus Wright and a handful of local leaders, whose faces bore the scars of too many broken promises. The room smelled faintly of mildew and determination, the walls lined with faded posters preaching unity and resilience. Naomi leaned forward, her voice steady but electric with purpose. "The investigation into Daniels is just the starting line," she said, her eyes locking with each of theirs in turn. "We need to push for real change training that roots out bias, oversight that actually holds people accountable, and a disciplinary process that doesn't just slap wrists. And the community has to be at the table, not on the sidelines." The group nodded, their energy crackling like static, feeding off her resolve. Marcus, a weary man with a voice that could cut through steel, chimed in, his enthusiasm barely contained. "I've already got the city council on board. They're setting up a public forum on police accountability next week. Naomi, you've got to be the one to speak." Her breath caught for a split second. Naomi wasn't one for spotlights. She preferred the quiet grind of casework, the satisfaction of piecing together truth from chaos. But she felt the weight of their eyes, the unspoken trust they'd placed in her, and she knew this was bigger than her comfort. "I'll do it," she said at last, her tone firm but measured. "But only if we make it crystal clear this isn't about one rogue cop. It's about dismantling a system that lets people like Daniels flourish unchecked." The room buzzed with agreement, a shared fire igniting among them. The days that followed were a storm of motion. The investigation into Daniels burrowed deeper, unearthing a trail of complaints, some written in shaky handwriting, others recorded in tearful voice that had been brushed aside like dust under a rug. Worse still, evidence surfaced that higher-ups had known, had quietly buried his missteps to protect their own. The media pounced, headlines screaming across front pages and social media feeds, each word chiseling away at the precinct's facade. Outside its doors, protesters gathered, their voices rising in a chorus of fury and hope, holding signs scrawled with demands and racial profiling, justice for all. Daniel's name became a lightning rod, plastered across every platform. his once careless authority eroding with every chant and every post. For Daniels, the world had shrunk to the four walls of his apartment, the blinds drawn tight against the clamor outside. He sat on his sagging couch, the TV flickering with live coverage of the growing unrest, his suspension replaying in his mind like a broken record. Regret gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, mingling with a resentment he couldn't quite shake. He'd never meant to be the villain, hadn't he just been doing his job, keeping order in a messy world? But the excuses felt flimsy now, collapsing under the weight of what he couldn't deny. By the time the public forum arrived, the city thrummed with tension, a live wire ready to snap. The auditorium was a sea of facetizens clutching notebooks, journalists with cameras poised, local leaders shifting nervously in their seats. Backstage, Naomi paced, her boots clicking against the scuffed floor, her hands clenching and unclenching as she steadied her nerves. Marcus appeared at her side, his presence a quiet anchor. "Ready?" he asked, resting a hand on her shoulder, his eyes warm with faith in her. She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Ready." As she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted, applause crashing over her like a wave. But she hadn't come for cheers, she'd come to turn this moment into a movement. The spotlight caught her as she reached the podium, illuminating the sharp lines of her face, the resolve in her dark eyes. She adjusted the microphone with deliberate care, her presence filling the space like a storm about to break. The crowd hushed, their anticipation a tangible thing, hanging heavy in the air. "Good evening," she began, her voice cutting through the silence, steady and resonant. "I stand here tonight not just as a detective, but as one of you, a member of a community that's been failed too many times by those who swore to protect it." Murmurs rippled through the audience, heads nodding, faces tightening with shared frustration and flickers of hope. "I've spent my career chasing justice, solving crimes, holding people to account. But tonight, I'm here because accountability isn't just for the lawbreakers, it's for the law enforcers too." She paused, letting the words sink in, her gaze sweeping the room. "The investigation into Officer Daniels has peeled back a layer of rot many of us knew was there. For too long, people in this city, your neighbors, our familiar shave, been targeted, profiled, and silenced. And for too long, those responsible have walked away unscathed." Her voice rose, a fire kindling beneath her calm exterior. "But that ends now. This isn't about one man, it's about a system that gave him free rein. A system that's overdue for an overhaul." The crowd roared, their cheers bouncing off the walls. A tide of sound she let wash over her before pressing on. "Since this started, I've listened to your stories, dozens of you, pouring out pain and strength I'll never forget. Together, we've proven that when we demand justice, we can force change." She turned slightly, gesturing to the city council members seated behind her, their faces a mix of unease and calculation. "Tonight, I'm calling on our leaders to step up, give us a community oversight board, mandatory training to confront bias head-on, and a disciplinary process that doesn't shield the guilty. No one should be above the law, badge or not." Applause swelled again, louder this time, the room pulsing with energy. Then she shifted, her tone sharpening as she addressed the officers watching from afar. "To those in uniform, hear this. This isn't about tearing you down. It's about building trust, proving to the people you serve that you're worthy of that badge. Accountability isn't just punishment, it's a chance to grow, to be better." As she stepped back, the crowd surged to their feet, a standing ovation that shook the rafters. Naomi's heart pounded, not with pride, but with the weight of what she saw in their face shape. Anger, determination mirroring her own. Across town, Daniels watched from his dim living room, the TV casting shadows across his hollow expression. He'd spent the week drowning in a fog of self-pity and defiance, but Naomi's words pierced through, sharp and unrelenting. They weren't just about him, they were about the machine he'd been a cog in, the power he'd swung like a club without a second thought. Memories flooded back, complaints he'd laughed off, lives he'd upended with a shrug. For the first time, he felt the full, crushing weight of it, a clarity that left him raw and exposed. The next morning, he typed out his resignation, his fingers trembling as they tapped the keys. No grand statement, no fight left in him, just a quiet surrender to the truth he couldn't outrun. He didn't deserve the badge anymore, and maybe he never had. In the weeks that followed, The city council bowed to the pressure, greenlighting a community oversight board as the police department rolled out reforms. Under a microscope, Marcus Wright threw himself into the fray, his tireless energy a perfect foil to Naomi's steady fire, ensuring the changes took root. For Naomi, life slipped back into its rhythm cases piling up. Late nights at her desk, her resolve burned brighter than ever. She'd won a battle, not the war, but it was enough to show her city that justice wasn't a pipe dream. Even the officers who'd once dismissed her now offered nods of respect as she passed, a silent acknowledgement of the strength she'd wielded. The lesson lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. Power unchecked breeds ruin, but justice, pursued with grit and heart, can topple even the sturdiest thrones. Naomi Harper wasn't finishing it by a long shot, and the city she fought for would never be the same.